What you're about to encounter is not an argument in the traditional sense. It is not a thesis that can be neatly filed into a discipline, debated on familiar terms, and resolved with existing frameworks. What follows is an attempt to surface something that operates beneath every framework, beneath every discipline, beneath every category you have ever used to make sense of the world. It is an attempt to show you that the very act of making sense is the mechanism by which certain systems remain permanently invisible to you, and that this invisibility is not accidental. It is architectural. It is the load-bearing wall of how power is constructed, maintained, and rendered unquestionable. And to even begin approaching what I'm about to lay out, you must first understand the prison you are already inside, the one that feels so much like freedom that you have never once tried the door. Let us start with something that every neuroscientist, every cognitive psychologist, every information theorist already knows, but has never fully followed to its terminal conclusion. The human brain processes roughly 11 million bits of sensory information per second. Of those 11 million bits, conscious awareness handles approximately 50. Not 50,000, not 50,000, 50. This is the work of Manfred Zimmermann at Heidelberg, extended by Nora Tranders in his exploration of what he called the user illusion, the idea that consciousness itself is a radically simplified dashboard, a summary screen that presents the output of processes you have no access to and cannot interrogate. What this means, and this is where we must be precise, is that for every single unit of information you are consciously aware of at any given moment, there are approximately 220,000 units of information that are being processed, filtered, discarded, or compressed beneath the threshold of your awareness. You are, at every waking moment, operating on a lossy compression of reality so severe that calling it a simplification does not begin to capture the violence of the reduction. Now, this compression is not a flaw. This is critical to understand. The compression is the evolutionary achievement. Daniel Kahneman built an entire Nobel Prize-winning body of work around the architecture of this compression, what he termed System 1 and System 2 thinking, where System 1 is the fast, automatic, heuristic-driven engine that handles the overwhelming majority of your daily cognition, and System 2 is the slow, deliberative, energy-expensive process that you engage only when forced. But Kahneman, for all his brilliance, was primarily interested in how this architecture produces errors in judgment, biases, deviations from rationality. What he did not fully pursue, and what almost no one has fully pursued, is the question of what becomes structurally invisible when this compression is operating at full capacity. Not what errors it produces, but what entire dimensions of reality it renders non-existent to the perceiver. Consider what happens when you drive down a commercial corridor in any American suburb. You pass a Planet Fitness, and your brain fires a single categorical tag, gym. You pass a Publix, and the tag fires, grocery store. You pass a Target, store, a Chick-fil-A, fast food, a Wells Fargo, bank. Each of these categorical tags is a compression event. Each one takes an entity of staggering internal complexity, an entity with supply chains, labor structures, capital allocation strategies, regulatory relationships, demographic targeting architectures, real estate calculus, insurance portfolios, and cultural semiotic functions, and reduces it to a single noun, gym, store, bank. And the moment that noun fires, the compression is complete. The entity has been indexed, filed, and dismissed from active cognitive processing. You can now navigate past it. You can now survive in its presence without being overwhelmed by its complexity. But you have also, in that exact moment, made everything about that entity that does not fit inside that noun permanently invisible to yourself. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal operational architecture of human perception. And it maps precisely onto what information theorists call lossy compression, the same process by which a JPEG image discards pixel data that the algorithm deems non-essential to the overall recognizability of the image. The image still looks like what it is supposed to look like. You can still identify the face, the landscape, the object, but the granular data, the fine textures, the subtle gradients, the information that would reveal what the image actually is at full resolution, that information has been permanently destroyed in the compression event. And here is the part that almost no one talks about. The algorithm that decides what to discard is not neutral. It is trained. It is trained by language, by culture, by education, by economic class, by the media environment, by the categorical infrastructure of the society you were raised in. The compression algorithm is a cultural artifact. And because it is a cultural artifact, it can be, and routinely is, engineered. This is where we move from cognitive science into political theory, and specifically into the territory that Antonio Gramsci mapped when he developed his theory of cultural hegemony. Gramsci understood, writing from a fascist prison cell in the 1930s, that the most effective form of power is not coercion. It is not the police, the military, the explicit apparatus of state violence. The most effective form of power is the ability to define what is common sense, to define what is natural, to define the categories through which a population perceives reality, such that the population consents to arrangements that may actively harm them, not because they have been forced to consent, but because the categorical infrastructure of their perception makes it impossible for them to see what they are consenting to. Gramsci called this the manufacture of consent, a phrase that Noam Chomsky would later adapt. But the core insight is pure Gramsci. Power operates most efficiently when it operates through the perceptual categories of the governed, when it is indistinguishable from the common sense of the governed, when it is so deeply embedded in how people see that they cannot distinguish it from seeing itself. Now, connect this to what Herbert Simon, the economist and cognitive scientist, termed bounded rationality. Simon argued in the 1950s that human beings do not optimize. They do not survey all available options, compute the utility of each, and select the maximum. They satisfice. They search through options until they find one that meets a minimum threshold of acceptability, and they stop. They stop not because they have found the best option, but because the cognitive cost of continuing to search exceeds the perceived benefit. This is a compression event at the level of decision-making. And what it means, when you follow it to its structural conclusion, is that every institution, every market, every social system that depends on human decision-making is operating on the basis of decisions that were made with radically incomplete information, not because the information was unavailable, but because the compression algorithm terminated the search before the information could be encountered. Now, scale this. Scale this from the individual to the population. What you get is not merely a collection of individuals making boundedly rational decisions. What you get is an entire civilization navigating reality through a shared compression algorithm, a shared set of categorical tags, a shared set of nouns and frameworks that determine what is visible and what is invisible, what is thinkable and what is unthinkable, what exists and what does not exist. And here is the proposition that sits at the foundation of everything that follows in this document. The most consequential systems in human civilization are not hidden because someone is deliberately hiding them. They are hidden because they operate in the dimensional space that the compression algorithm discards. They exist in the data that the JPEG threw away. They are the fine textures, the subtle gradients, the patterns that form between the patterns, the emergent properties that arise from configurations of variables that no single categorical tag can capture. And because the compression algorithm is culturally trained, because it is engineered by the very systems that benefit from their own invisibility, the invisibility is self-reinforcing. The system produces the perceptual conditions that make the system imperceptible. It is, in the language of cybernetics, a negative feedback loop of visibility, a homeostatic mechanism that maintains its own concealment. Consider what Michel Foucault understood about the relationship between knowledge and power, what he termed the power-knowledge nexus. Foucault argued that systems of knowledge do not merely describe reality, they produce it. The categories through which a society classifies things, the taxonomies, the diagnostic criteria, the legal definitions, the disciplinary boundaries, these are not neutral descriptions of a pre-existing world. They are acts of power that determine what can be seen, what can be said, what can be thought, and crucially, what cannot. When Foucault examined the history of madness, he did not find madness as a stable, naturally occurring phenomenon that medicine eventually learned to see correctly. He found madness as a category that was produced by specific institutional arrangements, specific economic pressures, specific cultural anxieties, and that the category itself, once produced, made certain people visible to the apparatus of the state in ways that stripped them of agency, liberty, and ultimately humanity. The compression algorithm, in Foucault's rendering, is not merely a cognitive convenience. It is a technology of governance. And this connects directly to what the philosopher Charles Mills, in his landmark work, The Racial Contract, called an epistemology of ignorance. Mills argued that white supremacy as a global political system does not merely oppress certain populations. It produces a specific form of ignorance in the beneficiaries of the system, a structured inability to see the system that benefits them. This is not stupidity. This is not a lack of information. This is an epistemological architecture, a way of knowing that is simultaneously a way of not knowing, a compression algorithm that is specifically calibrated to render the mechanisms of racial capitalism invisible to those who benefit from them. Mills understood that ignorance, in this context, is not the absence of knowledge. It is the presence of a specific kind of knowledge, a knowledge that fills the space where other knowledge could be, a knowledge that occupies the bandwidth, that satisfies, that fires the categorical tag and terminates the search. This is the prison. And the bars are made of categories. The bars are made of the nouns you use to navigate reality: gym, store, bank, employee, consumer, middle class, success, failure, legal, illegal, normal. Every single one of these words is a compression event. Every single one of these words is a tiny act of dimensional collapse, where the infinite complexity of what actually exists is flattened into a single plane of meaning that allows you to survive, to navigate, to function, but that simultaneously annihilates the dimensions in which the actual operative systems of your civilization are running. And the most insidious part, the part that makes this a genuine prison rather than merely a limitation, is that the compression feels like understanding. When you fire the categorical tag gym at Planet Fitness, you feel like you have understood what Planet Fitness is. You feel oriented. You feel competent. You feel like you know. And it is precisely that feeling of knowing, that false signal of cognitive completion, that prevents you from ever discovering what you do not know. The compression algorithm does not merely discard information, it generates a sense of completeness that inoculates you against the recognition of what has been discarded. This is what Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist and systems theorist, was reaching toward when he defined information as a difference which makes a difference. Bateson understood that perception is not the passive reception of data. Perception is the active selection of differences, certain differences and not others, from an infinite field of possible differences. And the differences you select are determined by the categories you already possess. You cannot perceive a difference for which you have no category. You cannot see a pattern for which you have no framework. And you cannot comprehend a system that operates in a dimensional space that your compression algorithm has already labeled as noise and discarded. The noise is not empty. The noise is where the actual systems live. So what follows in the subsequent sections of this document is an exercise in decompression. It is an attempt to take specific sites, specific entities, specific phenomena that your compression algorithm has already indexed and dismissed, and to re-enter them at a resolution so granular that the categorical tags dissolve and the hidden dimensions become visible. We will begin with a gas station that is not a gas station. We will move to a retail store that is not a retail store. We will examine how invisible actuarial systems create entire socioeconomic architectures beneath the surface of what you perceive as simply a town. We will connect quantum computing to cultural liminality, connect marine insurance to musical theater, connect the regulatory architecture of the City of London to the fictional architecture of Hogwarts. And by the time we reach the end, what will have been surfaced is not an argument that can be agreed or disagreed with in the conventional sense. What will have been surfaced is a dimension that was always there, operating, shaping, constraining, and producing the reality you thought you already understood. And the reason it was invisible is not because it was hidden. It is because you were trained from your very first breath not to see it. The compression algorithm gave you a world, a navigable, survivable, comprehensible world. But it took from you the actual world, and the distance between the two is not a gap. It is an abyss. And in that abyss, systems operate. Power consolidates, wealth concentrates, categories are enforced, and the governed consent, willingly, eagerly, gratefully, to arrangements they cannot perceive, because the compression that makes their world livable is the same compression that makes their captivity invisible. This is where we begin. But before we proceed, it is worth pausing on one more structural element of the compression algorithm that rarely receives the attention it deserves: the role of language itself as the primary compression technology. When Ferdinand de Saussure established the foundations of structural linguistics at the turn of the 20th century, he made a distinction that has shaped every subsequent theory of meaning. He distinguished between the signifier, the word, the sound, the written mark, and the signified, the concept that the signifier points toward. But what Saussure also understood, and what Jacques Derrida would later radicalize into an entire philosophical program, is that the relationship between signifier and signified is arbitrary. There is no natural, necessary connection between the word store and the infinitely complex socioeconomic, cultural, architectural entity that the word compresses into a single cognitive unit. The word is a lossy compression in the most literal sense. It takes a multidimensional phenomenon and flattens it into a one-dimensional symbol, and in so doing, it does not merely represent reality. It replaces reality. The word becomes the thing, the map becomes the territory. And once the map has replaced the territory becomes inaccessible, not because it has disappeared, but because the map has become the only navigational instrument available. And the map, by its very nature, cannot show you what it has omitted. Alfred Korzybski, the founder of general semantics, spent his career articulating precisely this problem. His famous dictum, "The map is not the territory," was not a clever aphorism. It was a warning. It was a warning that human beings are structurally incapable of distinguishing between their linguistic representations of reality and reality itself, and that this incapacity is not merely a philosophical curiosity, but a source of genuine, measurable, catastrophic dysfunction in human affairs. Korzybski argued that human beings are time-binding creatures, meaning that unlike animals, which are bound to the immediate stimulus-response environment, humans can transmit abstracted knowledge across generations through language. But this time-binding capacity comes at a price. Each generation inherits not only the knowledge of previous generations, but also the compression artifacts, the categorical distortions, the dimensional collapses that are embedded in the linguistic structures through which that knowledge was transmitted. You do not merely inherit English, you inherit the entire perceptual architecture that English enforces, the categories it makes available, the distinctions it permits, the dimensions it annihilates. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, in its strong form, suggests that the structure of a language determines the structure of thought itself, that speakers of different languages literally perceive different realities. While the strong form remains contested, the weak form, known as linguistic relativity, is broadly supported by empirical research. Lara Boroditsky at Stanford has demonstrated that speakers of languages with different spatial metaphors for time, or different grammatical structures for agency, exhibit measurably different cognitive behaviors when processing events, assigning causality, and even remembering what they have witnessed. What this means, structurally, is that the compression algorithm is not merely personal, it is linguistic, it is civilizational, it is embedded in the very medium through which all knowledge, all perception, all thought must pass. And if the medium is a compression technology, then every thought that has ever been thought, every perception that has ever been perceived, every piece of knowledge that has ever been transmitted, has already been lossy compressed before it reaches consciousness. The full resolution reality has never been seen by anyone. It has only been approximated, and the approximation has been mistaken for the thing itself, and that mistake is not a bug. It is the feature upon which the entire architecture of human civilization has been constructed. What follows is an attempt to decompress. Not fully, because full decompression would exceed the bandwidth of any human cognitive system, but enough. Enough to see the dimensions that the compression discards. Enough to perceive the patterns that form between the patterns. Enough to understand that the world you navigate every day is a radically simplified rendering of a reality so complex, so layered, so densely interconnected, that the systems operating within it are not merely difficult to see. They are categorically excluded from the perceptual field of every human being who has been trained, as all of us have been trained, to compress reality into the survival-grade resolution that language, culture, and cognition collectively enforce. The compression gave you a world. It took from you the actual one. And in the space between the two, everything that actually matters is happening. There is a moment that occurs at nearly every Buc-ee's location in the United States, and it occurs with such predictable regularity that it functions less as a spontaneous human reaction and more as a diagnostic event, a moment that reveals the compression algorithm in real time, catching it in the act of misfiling reality. The moment happens when a customer, usually someone visiting for the first time, encounters the sign near the entrance or posted visibly within the store that advertises leadership and management positions at six-figure salaries. The reaction is almost always the same: a pause, a double take, an audible expression of surprise, sometimes disbelief, occasionally admiration. The phrase that follows is some variant of the same sentence: a gas station manager making six figures. And in that sentence, in that precise formulation, the entire architecture of the compression algorithm is exposed. Because the surprise is not a response to the salary. The surprise is a response to the collision between the salary and the category. The category is gas station. And within that category, the compression algorithm has preloaded a set of assumptions about scale, complexity, labor requirements, revenue, and prestige that make a six-figure management salary seem anomalous, excessive, almost absurd. The surprise is the sound of a category failing to contain reality. And what is remarkable is not that the category fails, but that the human response to the failure is not to question the category. It is to marvel at the exception. This is precisely the mechanism that needs to be decompressed. Because what is happening at Buc-ee's is not an exception. It is a revelation, but one that the compression algorithm is specifically designed to suppress. When you categorize Buc-ee's as a gas station, you are performing a dimensional collapse so severe that it is analogous to looking at an aircraft carrier and calling it a boat. The word gas station fires a categorical tag that imports an entire constellation of assumptions: a small building, a few pumps, a limited selection of snacks and beverages, a single cashier, fluorescent lighting, a restroom of questionable hygiene, and a transactional relationship with the customer that lasts approximately 4 minutes. This is the prototype, the schema, the cognitive model that the word gas station activates. And every one of these assumptions is catastrophically wrong when applied to Buc-ee's. But the compression algorithm does not care about accuracy. It cares about efficiency. It needs to index the entity and move on. It needs to clear cognitive bandwidth for the next entity. And so it fires the tag, imports the prototype, and dismisses everything that does not fit as noise. But let us now do what the compression algorithm refuses to do. Let us actually look at what Buc-ee's is. A typical Buc-ee's location occupies between 50,000 and 75,000 square feet of retail space. To put that in context, the average Walmart supercenter occupies approximately 180,000 square feet, and the average Target occupies approximately 130,000 square feet. A standard convenience store attached to a gas station occupies between 2,000 and 4,000 square feet. So Buc-ee's is not a convenience store with gas pumps. It is a retail operation that is between 1/3 and 1/2 the size of a Walmart supercenter, operating with a focused inventory strategy, higher per square foot revenue density, and a destination retail model that draws customers from distances of 50 to 100 miles or more. When you recategorize Buc-ee's from gas station to mid-format specialty grocer and destination retail operation with fuel amenities, the six-figure management salary does not merely stop being surprising. It starts looking like it might be low, and this is where the decompression becomes genuinely revealing. Because the question is not, why does Buc-ee's pay its managers six figures? The question is, why does the category gas station persist when it so catastrophically misrepresents the operational reality of the entity? And the answer is that the category persists because it serves a function. It serves the function of making Buc-ee's legible within the existing hierarchy of commercial categories, a hierarchy that is itself a compression artifact, a simplified ranking of businesses by perceived prestige, complexity, and economic significance. In this hierarchy, gas station sits near the bottom. It is blue-collar, it is transactional, it is interchangeable, and because Buc-ee's is categorized as a gas station, it inherits all of these associations, which means that its labor, its management, its operational complexity are all perceived through the lens of a category that systematically undervalues them. This is not unique to Buc-ee's. This is the mechanism by which entire sectors of the economy become invisible as sites of genuine complexity and value creation. Consider the category fast food. McDonald's Corporation, as of its most recent annual filings, operates or franchises approximately 40,000 locations across more than 100 countries, manages a real estate portfolio that is among the most valuable on Earth, employs sophisticated supply chain logistics that coordinate the movement of agricultural commodities across multiple continents, deploys dynamic pricing algorithms, hedges currency risk across dozens of markets, and generates annual revenues in excess of $23 billion. The operational complexity of McDonald's is comparable to that of a mid-sized sovereign nation. But the category fast food compresses all of this into an image of a teenager handing you a bag through a window. And because the category persists, because the compression holds, the actual system that McDonald's represents, a system of global supply chain coordination, agricultural commodity speculation, real estate arbitrage, and labor force management at planetary scale, remains invisible to the vast majority of the population that interacts with it daily. Now consider what this invisibility produces. When a system is invisible, it cannot be interrogated. When it cannot be interrogated, it cannot be regulated with precision. When it cannot be regulated with precision, it operates with a degree of freedom that is directly proportional to its invisibility. The compression algorithm is not merely a cognitive convenience, it is a regulatory shield. It is a mechanism by which systems of enormous scale and consequence operate beneath the threshold of public scrutiny, not because they are hidden in any deliberate sense, but because the categorical infrastructure through which the public perceives them is so crude, so lossy, so dimensionally impoverished, that the actual system simply does not fit within the perceptual field. Let us push this further with Buc-ee's specifically, because the decompression reveals layers that are genuinely instructive. When you recategorize Buc-ee's as a grocery and retail operation, the first thing that changes is your perception of its inventory. Under the gas station category, the sheer volume and variety of food products that Buc-ee's carries registers as an amusing excess, a charming, over-the-top quality that is part of the brand's folksy appeal. But under the grocery store category, the same inventory registers entirely differently. What you see, when you see it clearly, is a grocery operation that carries almost no fresh produce, almost no raw proteins, almost no dairy, beyond packaged cheese and ice cream, and almost no whole grains or staple foods. What it carries, in enormous volume and variety, is processed snacks, candies, baked goods, jerky, fudge, preservative-laden prepared foods, and sugared beverages. Under the gas station category, this is delightful. Under the grocery store category, this is a 60,000 square foot monument to nutritional vacuity. The same physical reality, the same shelves, the same products, but a completely different evaluative framework, triggered entirely by which categorical tag the compression algorithm fires. And the evaluative shift does not stop at inventory. Consider foot traffic. Under the gas station category, the sheer volume of customers flowing through a Buc-ee's location on any given day is perceived as remarkable, noteworthy, a testament to the brand's unique appeal. Visitors take photographs, they post on social media, they treat the visit as an event, a destination experience. But under the grocery store category, the same foot traffic is merely what you would expect from a mid to large format retail operation located at a major highway interchange with 100+ fuel pumps serving as a customer acquisition funnel. The foot traffic is not remarkable. It is structural. It is the predictable output of a location strategy that places a retail operation at a node of maximum vehicular flow and uses fuel as a loss leader to drive store entry. This is not innovative. This is the same strategy that warehouse clubs like Costco have used for decades, where the fuel offering drives membership acquisition and store visits. Buc-ee's has simply executed this strategy at highway scale rather than suburban commercial scale, substituting road trip traffic for weekly shopping trips. And this brings us to the salary question again, but now with entirely different framing. When you decompress Buc-ee's from gas station to destination retail operation with fuel-driven customer acquisition at highway scale, the manager of that operation is not a gas station manager. That manager is overseeing a retail operation with foot traffic that rivals or exceeds a Walmart, with inventory management across hundreds of SKUs, with a labor force that often exceeds 200 employees per location operating across multiple shifts on a 24-hour cycle, with food safety compliance across multiple preparation areas, with fuel operations that involve the management of underground storage tanks and compliance with EPA regulations, with cash management at volumes that require armored car services, with loss prevention across a facility that spans more than an acre of retail space. The six-figure salary, when viewed at this resolution, is not generous. It is, as you begin to realize when the compression lifts, potentially below market rate for the complexity of the role. But here is the deeper structural point, the one that connects this observation to the larger argument about invisibility and power. The compression algorithm does not merely misrepresent Buc-ee's, it misrepresents the labor of the people who work there. When the entity is categorized as a gas station, the workers within that entity are categorized as gas station employees, with all of the attendant assumptions about skill level, replaceability, economic value, and social prestige. The manager becomes a gas station manager, a phrase that carries a specific class valence in American culture, a phrase that is, in certain social circles, a punchline. And this class valence, this categorical devaluation of the labor, is not an unfortunate side effect of the compression. It is one of the things the compression produces. The misrecognition of the entity produces the misrecognition of the labor, and the misrecognition of the labor produces a condition in which the labor can be compensated below its actual market value, because both the laborer and the market are operating within a categorical framework that systematically underestimates the complexity and value of what is being done. This is what Karl Marx was reaching toward in his theory of commodity fetishism, though Marx was focused on the concealment of labor within the commodity itself. What we are observing here is a related but distinct phenomenon, the concealment of labor complexity within the categorical infrastructure that society uses to classify the site where the labor occurs. The labor is not hidden inside the product, the labor is hidden inside the category. And the category, because it is a shared cultural artifact, because it is part of the common sense that Gramsci identified as the medium of hegemonic power, is not perceived as a tool of concealment. It is perceived as a description. It is perceived as what the thing simply is. And because it is perceived as what the thing simply is, the concealment is perfect. It does not look like concealment. It looks like reality. This is the first decompression. This is what happens when you take a single categorical tag, gas station, and refuse to let the compression algorithm terminate your investigation. What emerges is not merely a more accurate picture of Buc-ee's. What emerges is a structural insight into how categorical infrastructure operates as a mechanism of economic invisibility, how the very language we use to classify commercial entities functions as a system of labor devaluation, and how the surprise that people feel when they encounter the salary sign at Buc-ee's is not a response to an anomaly, but a symptom of a perceptual architecture that is operating exactly as designed, producing precisely the ignorance that it was built to produce. And if this is what a single decompression reveals at the scale of a roadside retailer, consider what awaits when we turn this same decompressive lens on entities whose categorical camouflages is orders of magnitude more sophisticated. But before we move on, there is one more dimension of the Buc-ee's decompression that demands attention, because it reveals something about the relationship between marketing and categorical exploitation that is rarely articulated. Buc-ee's knows that it is miscategorized. The company's marketing strategy does not fight the miscategorization, it exploits it. The six-figure salary sign is itself a marketing device that functions precisely because of the categorical error it triggers. The sign is effective, not despite the surprise it generates, but because of it. The surprise creates a cognitive disruption, a moment of heightened attention, a glitch in the compression algorithm that forces the observer to attend to the entity with more cognitive bandwidth than they would normally allocate to a gas station. And in that moment of heightened attention, the brand imprints with unusual intensity. The surprise becomes the memory. The categorical error becomes the brand identity. Buc-ee's becomes that gas station where the manager makes six figures, which is a far more memorable and shareable brand identity than mid-format specialty grocer at highway interchange, which is what the entity actually is. This is a marketing strategy that operates by exploiting the compression algorithm rather than fighting it. It accepts the miscategorization and then introduces a data point that is incongruent with the category, creating a productive cognitive dissonance that generates attention, memorability, and word-of-mouth transmission. Every person who posts about Buc-ee's on social media, who tells a friend about the salary sign, who describes the size and scale and variety of the store with visible amazement, is performing a marketing function for Buc-ee's, and the fuel for that performance is the categorical error. The error is the engine, the compression is the opportunity, and the surplus value is extracted not from the labor of the workers, though that too, but from the cognitive architecture of the customers, whose compression algorithm is being systematically exploited to produce free advertising at scale. This reveals a broader principle about the relationship between marketing and the compression algorithm that is almost never discussed in marketing literature. The most effective marketing does not operate by providing more information about a product. It operates by disrupting the categorical framework within which the product is perceived. Red Bull does not market itself as an energy drink. It markets itself as a performance and extreme sports brand that happens to sell a beverage. Apple does not market itself as a computer company. It markets itself as a lifestyle and identity brand that happens to make electronics. Tesla does not market itself as a car manufacturer. It markets itself as a technology and sustainability brand that happens to produce vehicles. In each case, the marketing strategy is a deliberate act of categorical disruption, an intentional mismatch between the product category and the brand identity that creates cognitive dissonance, generates attention, and produces a form of brand loyalty that transcends the transactional relationship between customer and product. The customer is not buying a product. The customer is resolving a categorical ambiguity. And the resolution, the act of integrating the incongruent data point into a new, expanded understanding of what the entity is, produces a feeling of insight, of discovery, of being in on something that is far more powerful than any rational assessment of product quality or value. Buc-ee's is doing this intuitively, at highway scale, with a piece of printed signage. But the structural principle is the same one that operates in every domain we will examine in this document. The power lies in the space between the category and the reality. The gap is the resource. The compression is the opportunity. And the entities that learn to exploit this gap, whether they are roadside retailers, cultural figures, financial institutions, or sovereign jurisdictions, generate a form of power that the categorical system cannot contain because the power derives from the system's own limitations. Consider what happens when we decompress a target. That is where we go next. If the Buc-ee's decompression revealed how a categorical tag can conceal economic complexity, the target decompression reveals something far more unsettling: how a categorical tag can conceal an entire metaphysical operation. Because when you strip away the category of store from target, what you find underneath is not a more complex version of a store. What you find is a temple, a space of ritual, of identity formation, of communal belief performance, operating with a liturgical precision that would be immediately recognizable to any theologian, any anthropologist of religion, any scholar of sacred architecture, if only they could see past the categorical tag that makes the sacred dimension invisible. To understand how this works, we need to begin not with target, but with what a church actually is, functionally, when you decompress it from its own categorical tag, because church is itself a compression. The word fires and imports a prototype, a building with pews, a cross, a pulpit, hymns, a congregation, a pastor. But the functional architecture of what a church does is far more complex than this prototype suggests. Drawing on the work of Emile Durkheim, whose Elementary Forms of Religious Life remains the foundational text on the sociology of religion, a church performs several distinct operations simultaneously. First, it creates a boundary between the sacred and the profane, designating certain spaces, times, objects, and practices as set apart from ordinary life. Second, it provides a site for the collective performance of shared belief, what Durkheim called collective effervescence, the experience of individual identity dissolving into communal identity through synchronized ritual action. Third, it produces and reinforces a moral community, a group of people who share not merely beliefs, but a sense of mutual obligation and belonging that derives from those beliefs. Fourth, and this is the operation that is most relevant to our purposes, it makes an aspirational identity available for performance. When a person enters a church, they are not merely attending a service, they are performing an identity. They are enacting, through their physical presence and participation, the proposition that they are a person of faith, a member of this community, a practitioner of this way of being. The church does not merely describe an identity, it provides the stage upon which that identity can be performed, witnessed, and thereby made real. Now, apply this functional architecture to target, and watch what happens. The first operation, the creation of a boundary between sacred and profane, is accomplished at target through design. This is not incidental. This is the product of one of the most sophisticated retail design philosophies in American commerce. Target stores are designed with a brightness, a cleanliness, a spatial openness, and a chromatic consistency that is qualitatively different from the visual environment of a Walmart, a Dollar General, or a Family Dollar. The lighting is warmer, the aisles are wider. The product displays are curated with a specificity that resembles gallery installation more than inventory management. The color palette, the iconic red against clean white, functions as a semiotic marker that separates the target environment from the commercial landscape that surrounds it. When you cross the threshold of a target, you're entering a space that has been designed to feel different from ordinary commercial space. You're entering a space that has been set apart. And this setting apart is not merely aesthetic, it is functional. It performs the same boundary creation operation that the narthex of a church performs, the transitional space between the profane world outside and the sacred space within. The automatic doors open, you pass through, and the quality of the environment shifts. The noise changes, the light changes, the tempo of movement changes. You have entered. The second operation, the collective performance of shared belief, is accomplished through the shopping experience itself. And here, we must be precise about what belief is being performed, because this is where the decompression becomes genuinely destabilizing. The belief that is being performed at Target is not a belief in a deity. It is a belief in the American middle class. It is a belief in the proposition that a specific constellation of material conditions, a clean and well-ordered home, tasteful but affordable clothing, organic but accessible food, aesthetically pleasing but not extravagant household goods, constitutes not merely a standard of living but an identity. The American middle class, as a sociological category, was largely constructed in the post-World War II period through a confluence of policy instruments. The GI Bill, which provided returning veterans with access to higher education and home ownership, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration mortgage programs, which subsidized suburban home ownership on an unprecedented scale, the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, which created the physical infrastructure for suburban living, and the broader Keynesian economic consensus that sustained relatively high wages, strong unions, and expanding consumer credit through the 1950s and 60s. What these policies produced was not merely a class of people with certain income levels. They produced an identity, a way of being American that was defined by consumption patterns. To be middle class was to own a home, to own a car, to furnish that home with specific categories of goods, to dress in specific ways, to eat specific foods, to participate in specific leisure activities. The identity was constituted by the consumption. The consumption was not an expression of a pre-existing identity. The consumption was the identity. And Target, when you decompress it from store, is the space where this identity is performed. When a customer walks through Target, selecting a throw pillow from the threshold line, examining a candle from Magnolia, considering a dress from A New Day, browsing the organic section of the grocery aisle, they are not merely shopping. They are performing. They are enacting through the ritualized selection of objects that have been curated to signify middle-class taste. The proposition that they belong to the middle class. They are performing respectability. They are performing stability. They are performing the American dream. And Target, through its design, its curation, its branding, its private label architecture, is providing the liturgy. It is providing the hymnal. It is providing the script for the ritual, the vestments for the performance, and the sacred space in which the performance can occur. This is why Target's brand loyalty operates differently from Walmart's. Walmart's value proposition is economic, low prices. The relationship is transactional. The customer goes to Walmart because Walmart offers the lowest cost for the goods the customer needs. The identity dimension is minimal, and to the extent that it exists, it is often experienced negatively as a marker of economic constraint rather than aspirational identity. Target's value proposition, by contrast, is only partially economic. The prices at Target are not consistently lower than competitors. In many categories, they are higher. What Target offers is not low prices. It offers the experience of being a person who shops at Target rather than Walmart. It offers membership in a taste community. It offers the performance of a specific class identity. And this is why customers at Target describe their shopping experience in language that is structurally indistinguishable from the language of religious devotion. They describe themselves as Target obsessed. They describe unplanned purchases as evidence of the store's almost supernatural power over their behavior. They describe the experience of browsing Target as therapeutic, restorative, a form of self-care. These are not rational descriptions of a commercial transaction. These are descriptions of a ritual experience, a performance of identity within a sacred space, an experience of what Durkheim would immediately recognize as collective effervescence, the dissolution of individual isolation into communal belonging through synchronized participation in a shared symbolic system. The third operation, the production of a moral community, is accomplished through Target's brand positioning and political cultural alignment. Target has, particularly since the 2010s, positioned itself as a progressive, inclusive, socially conscious brand. This is not merely a marketing strategy, though it is certainly that. It is a community formation strategy. By aligning itself with specific social values, inclusivity, diversity, sustainability, environmental consciousness, Target creates a moral dimension to the shopping experience. To shop at Target is not merely to perform middle-class taste, it is to perform middle-class virtue. It is to participate in a community of shared moral commitments. And this moral community, like the moral community of a church, provides its members with a sense of belonging that transcends the transactional nature of the individual interaction. You are not merely buying a candle, you are participating in a community of people who buy candles at Target, which means you are participating in a community of people who share your taste, your values, your sense of what constitutes a good and responsible life. The fourth operation, the availability of aspirational identity for performance, is where Target's function as a belief infrastructure becomes most visible and most powerful. Consider who shops at Target. Target's customer base includes, in significant proportion, individuals and families whose actual economic conditions do not securely place them in the middle class by any rigorous sociological measure. Individuals carrying consumer debt. Individuals living paycheck to paycheck. Individuals whose housing is precarious, whose healthcare is uncertain, whose retirement savings are inadequate or non-existent. Individuals who, by the structural metrics of economic security, are working class or working poor. And yet these individuals shop at Target. They do not shop at Target because the prices are lowest. They shop at Target because Target provides them with the space and the script to perform an identity, middle-class respectability, that their actual economic conditions do not support. The performance is aspirational. It is an act of faith. It is the enactment of a belief in a future that may never arrive, or in a present that does not correspond to material reality, or in an identity that exists only in the moment of its performance within the sacred space. And this is indistinguishable, functionally, structurally, phenomenologically, from what happens in a church. When a person who is struggling, who is suffering, who is uncertain about the future enters a church and participates in the service, they are performing an act of faith. They are enacting, through their presence and participation, a belief in a reality that transcends their current circumstances. They are performing an identity, child of God, member of the faithful, participant in a cosmic narrative of redemption that their immediate material conditions may not support. The church provides the space for this performance. It provides the liturgy, the symbols, the community, the sacred boundary within which the performance can occur. And the performance itself, the act of showing up, of participating, of performing the identity, is the practice. The practice is the belief. The doing is the being. Target does the same thing. And the fact that it does the same thing while being categorized as a store is precisely what makes its operation as a belief infrastructure invisible. The category store compresses the entity into a commercial transaction. Goods are displayed, customers select them, money changes hands. The metaphysical dimension, the identity performance, the aspirational ritual, the moral community, the sacred boundary, all of this is compressed out. It is treated as noise. It is discarded by the algorithm. And what remains is the JPEG, the lossy rendering, the simplified version that allows you to navigate the entity without being overwhelmed by its actual complexity. But the actual complexity does not disappear because you fail to perceive it. The actual complexity continues to operate. The belief infrastructure continues to function. The ritual continues to be performed. The identity continues to be produced. The compression merely renders all of this invisible, which means that the metaphysical operation of Target, its function as a secular church of middle-class American identity, operates without scrutiny, without critique, without even the basic recognition that it is occurring. And this is power. This is the kind of power that Gramsci understood, the power that operates through the perceptual categories of the governed, the power that is indistinguishable from common sense, the power that does not need to be enforced because it is embedded in how people see. Target does not force anyone to perform middle-class identity. It does not coerce anyone into treating consumption as a form of worship. It simply provides the space, the script, the symbols, and the community, and the compression algorithm does the rest. The compression ensures that the ritual is invisible as a ritual, that the worship is invisible as worship, that the belief is invisible as belief. And because the belief is invisible as belief, it cannot be questioned as belief. It can only be lived. It can only be practiced. It can only be performed again and again in the clean, well-lit, carefully curated space that has been set apart from the profane world outside. Guy Debord, in The Society of the Spectacle, argued that in advanced capitalist societies, lived experience has been replaced by representation. Life is no longer lived directly. It is mediated through images, through spectacles, through performances that substitute for authentic experience. But Debord, writing in the 1960s, could not have anticipated the degree to which the spectacle would become indistinguishable from the infrastructure of daily life. Target is not a spectacle in Debord's sense, not a discrete performance that can be identified as such and critiqued. Target is an environment. It is an infrastructure. It is a space that has been so seamlessly integrated into the rhythms and routines of daily life that its function as a performance space, as a site of belief production, as a secular cathedral of consumer identity, is completely invisible. You do not go to Target to perform a ritual. You go to Target to buy paper towels. And it is precisely because you go to Target to buy paper towels that the ritual works. The profane purpose, the mundane errand, is the camouflage. The transaction is the cover story. The actual operation, the production and reproduction of a class identity through ritualized consumption in a sacralized commercial space, occurs beneath the surface of the transaction, invisible, uninterrogated, and therefore unopposed. This is what I mean when I say that the compression algorithm does not merely simplify reality. It produces a specific form of ignorance that functions as consent. When you see Target as a store, you consent to its operation as a belief infrastructure, not because you have evaluated that operation and accepted it, but because you cannot see it. Your consent is produced by your blindness is produced by the category, and the category is produced by a civilization that has organized its entire perceptual architecture around the principle that certain dimensions of reality must remain invisible in order for the system to function. There is a word for a system in which people participate in rituals they do not recognize as rituals, perform beliefs they do not recognize as beliefs, and consent to arrangements they cannot perceive. That word has been used in various forms by various thinkers: false consciousness by the Marxists, the spectacle by the situationists, biopower by Foucault, the simulacrum by Baudrillard. But all of these terms, however useful, still operate within the categorical infrastructure they are trying to critique. They are themselves compressions. What we are attempting here is not a new critical vocabulary. It is a decompression event. It is the act of taking the compression itself apart, not by naming it from within the existing categorical system, but by expanding the resolution until the categorical system itself becomes visible as an artifact, a constructed thing, a technology with a history and a function and beneficiaries. And if Target is a church, then the question becomes, what is the denomination? What is the theology? Who are the clergy? Who wrote the liturgy? And who benefits from the fact that the congregation does not know it is a congregation? These are not rhetorical questions. These are structural questions. And the answers to them lead directly into the next dimension of the decompression, the invisible actuarial and underwriting architecture that operates beneath the surface of every town, every community, every commercial corridor that you have ever driven through without seeing. There is a concept that has no formal name in any existing academic discipline, and the absence of that name is itself evidence of the phenomenon it describes. It is the idea that within any given resolution of reality, within any given perceptual framework operated by a civilization at a particular moment in history, there exist entire systems that are fully operational, fully consequential, and fully invisible, not because they are small or distant or deliberately concealed, but because the dimensional space in which they operate has not yet been cognitively accessed by the perceiving civilization. I call this the dimension lacuna. A lacuna is a gap, an absence, a missing piece in a manuscript or a record. But this is not a gap in a text. This is a gap in the dimensional field of perception itself. It is a missing dimension, a dimension that contains real, operative, consequential phenomena, but that does not exist within the perceptual architecture of the observer. And because it does not exist within the perceptual architecture, the phenomena it contains do not merely go unnoticed. They do not exist. They are ontologically absent from the observer's reality, present in the actual reality, but absent from the experienced reality. And the distance between those two realities is the dimension lacuna. To understand the dimension lacuna, consider a thought experiment that is not a thought experiment, but a historical fact. In the year 1675, imagine two people who are in love. One lives in the American colonies, the other lives in Paris. They are separated by the Atlantic Ocean. Their only means of communication is written letters carried by sailing vessels, and the transit time for a letter from the colonies to Paris is between 6 and 12 weeks, depending on weather, season, and the availability of ships. This is their reality. This is the resolution at which their civilization operates. And within that resolution, the idea that one of them could speak a sentence in the colony and have it heard by the other in Paris within the same second is not merely impossible. It is inconceivable. It does not register as a possibility that has been ruled out. It does not register at all. It occupies no space whatsoever in their conceptual universe. And yet, the physical conditions for that instantaneous communication already exist in 1675. The electromagnetic spectrum exists. Radio waves propagate at the speed of light through the atmosphere in 1675, exactly as they do today. The physics is already there. The dimension is already there. What is not there is the cognitive framework, the perceptual architecture, the conceptual infrastructure that would allow a human mind to perceive the electromagnetic spectrum as a dimension of reality that could be accessed, manipulated, and used for communication. This is the dimension lacuna in its purest form. The system, electromagnetic communication, is fully operational in the physical world. It is doing what it does. Radio waves are bouncing off the ionosphere in 1675. They are refracting through the atmosphere. They are behaving exactly according to the laws that James Clerk Maxwell will not formalize for another 200 years. The system exists. It functions. But it has no existence whatsoever in the experienced reality of any human being alive in 1675. It is in the lacuna, and the lacuna is not empty. The lacuna is pregnant. It is pregnant with systems that are waiting, not in any teleological sense, not with intentionality, but in the structural sense that the physical conditions for their emergence into perceived reality already exist. And what is required for that emergence is not a change in physics, but a change in perception, a change in the dimensional architecture of human cognition, a new framework, a new category, a new way of seeing that can bring the hidden dimension into the field of the visible. This is what Thomas Kuhn was describing though he may not have realized the full implications when he developed the concept of the paradigm shift in the structure of scientific revolutions. Kuhn argued that scientific progress does not occur through the gradual accumulation of knowledge within a stable framework. It occurs through revolutionary transformations of the framework itself, transformations that change not merely what scientists know, but what they can see. Before Copernicus, astronomers saw the sun moving across the sky. After Copernicus, they saw the Earth rotating. The physical reality had not changed. The perceptual framework had changed. And with that change, an entirely new dimensional space became accessible, a space that contained phenomena, orbital mechanics, gravitational relationships, the structure of the solar system, that had always existed, but that had been categorically invisible within the previous framework. But Kuhn was focused on the history of science, on the formal, institutional, methodological process by which professional knowledge producers shift their paradigms. What the dimension lacuna concept captures is something much broader and much more unsettling. The proposition that at any given moment, including this one, the civilization you inhabit is operating within a perceptual framework that renders entire dimensions of reality invisible, and that within those invisible dimensions, systems are operating that shape your life in ways you cannot detect, cannot name, cannot interrogate, and cannot resist, because the cognitive infrastructure you would need to perceive them does not yet exist within your civilization's categorical architecture. Consider germ theory. Before the work of Pasteur, Koch, Semmelweis, and their contemporaries in the mid to late 19th century, the dimension of microbial life was in the lacuna. Bacteria existed, viruses existed, they lived on surfaces, in water, in food, in the air. They entered human bodies, replicated, caused disease, and killed. They did all of this in full operational reality, and they did all of this in complete dimensional invisibility. A person in 1750 could drop a piece of bread on the floor, pick it up, eat it, and experience no cognitive registration whatsoever of the microbial ecosystem that had just been transferred to the food and from the food into their body. The dimension of microbial causality simply did not exist in their perceptual architecture. And so they died. They died of infections they could not see, caused by organisms they could not conceive of, transmitted through mechanisms they had no framework to detect. They attributed their illnesses to miasma, to bad air, to divine punishment, to imbalances of humors, because these were the categories available within their perceptual framework. And the compression algorithm, as always, fired the available tag and terminated the search. What Pasteur and Koch accomplished was not merely the discovery of bacteria, it was the opening of a new dimension. It was the construction of a cognitive framework that allowed human perception to access a dimensional space that had always existed but had never been seen. And once that dimension was opened, once the lacuna was breached, an entire cascade of emergent systems became visible: epidemiology, immunology, public health, sanitation engineering, food safety regulation, pharmaceutical development, surgical antisepsis. None of these systems could have existed while the microbial dimension was in the lacuna, not because the physical conditions for them were absent, but because the cognitive conditions for perceiving them were absent. The systems were pregnancies within the lacuna, waiting for the dimensional breach that would bring them into perceived reality. Now, I want to push this concept into territory that is genuinely uncomfortable, because the dimension lacuna is not merely a historical phenomenon. It is not something that happened in the past and has been resolved by the progress of science and technology. It is a permanent structural feature of human cognition. There are dimensions in the lacuna right now. There are systems operating in those dimensions right now, and they are shaping your life right now, with the same invisibility, the same consequentiality, and the same total absence from your perceptual field that microbial life had in 1750 or electromagnetic radiation had in 1675. And this is not speculation. We know this must be true because the fundamental constraint that produces the dimension lacuna, the radical lossy compression that reduces 11 million bits per second to 50 bits of conscious awareness, has not changed. The compression ratio is the same. The cognitive architecture is the same. The evolutionary hardware that processes perception, that fires categorical tags, that simplifies reality into a survival-grade resolution, is the same hardware that our ancestors used in 1675 and 1750 and 1850. What has changed is the number of dimensions that have been breached, the number of previously invisible systems that have been brought into the perceptual field. But the field itself is still finite, the bandwidth is still limited, the compression is still lossy, and for every dimension that has been opened, for every system that has been made visible, there remain, by structural necessity, dimensions that are still closed, systems that are still invisible, lacunae that are still pregnant with operational realities that we cannot detect. What are they? What systems are operating in your dimension lacuna right now? This is, of course, a question that cannot be fully answered from within the current perceptual framework, because the whole point of the lacuna is that it contains what the framework cannot access. But we can do something that is, in its own way, revolutionary. We can look at the edges, We can look at the places where the compression algorithm is straining, where the categorical tags are failing, where the noise that the algorithm discards is beginning to organize itself into patterns that refuse to be ignored. We can look for the signatures of dimensional pregnancy, the signs that a system is forming in the invisible space between the visible categories, preparing to breach the lacuna and enter perceived reality. And one of the most fertile sites for this kind of observation, one of the places where the lacuna is thinnest, where the invisible dimension is closest to the surface of visibility, is the intersection of data, risk, and human behavior that we call insurance. Because insurance, as an industry, as a mathematical discipline, as a regulatory system, and as a philosophical framework, is in the business of looking at exactly the dimensions that the compression algorithm discards. Insurance is the formalized attempt to see what ordinary perception cannot see. It is the institutionalization of decompression, and what it sees, in those decompressed dimensions, constitutes an entire invisible architecture that shapes every town, every community, every life, every economic decision, every social relationship, with a pervasiveness and a precision that makes it one of the most powerful systems operating in the dimension lacuna of ordinary human perception. This is not an accident. The invisibility of insurance as a structural force is not a contingent feature that could be otherwise. It is a necessary feature. Insurance operates in the lacuna because the lacuna is where it must operate. Insurance is, by its very nature, a system that deals in probabilities, in aggregated risk, in actuarial distributions that describe populations rather than individuals, in time horizons that extend decades into the future, in correlations between variables that are individually invisible to any single human observer. A person driving through a town sees cars. Insurance sees a multivariate probability distribution mapped across age, gender, vehicle type, driving history, credit score, geographic risk zone, claims frequency, severity modeling, and reinsurance treaty structures. A person sees a house. Insurance sees a nexus of property valuation, wind zone classification, floodplain proximity, construction type, age of electrical wiring, distance from the nearest fire hydrant, and replacement cost estimation. These are different dimensions of the same reality. They coexist in the same physical space, but they are cognitively inaccessible to each other. The person driving through the town cannot see the actuarial dimension, and the actuarial dimension, for all its mathematical precision, cannot see the human experience of driving through the town. They are separated by a dimensional boundary that is as real, as consequential, and as impermeable as the boundary that separated the 18th century physician from the microbial ecosystem on the surface of his unwashed hands. And the systems that operate in this actuarial dimension, the systems that determine who can afford to drive, who can afford to own a home, who can afford to start a business, who can afford to take a risk, who's priced into economic participation, and who is priced out. These systems are among the most powerful determinants of life outcomes in the modern world, and they are almost entirely invisible to the people whose lives they determine. They are in the lacuna. They are the water in which we swim without knowing we are wet. And the next section will decompress this dimension. We'll attempt to make visible the invisible actuarial architecture that operates beneath the surface of every community, every street, every commercial corridor that you have ever driven through without seeing. Because the dimension lacuna is not empty. It is full. It is full of systems. And those systems are not waiting to be born. They are already operating. They have always been operating. The only thing that has been absent is the perception. And perception is what we are building now, dimension by dimension, decompression by decompression, until the resolution of reality becomes high enough to see what has been there all along. But there is a specific mechanism by which systems in the dimension lacuna begin their transition from invisible to visible, and this mechanism deserves its own examination because it reveals something fundamental about the relationship between the invisible and the visible, between the dimension that is hidden and the moment of its emergence. I call this mechanism the pregnancy of patterns. It works like this. Within the invisible dimension, within the lacuna, there are configurations of data, relationships, variables, forces that form patterns. These patterns are not random. They are structured by the same physical, social, economic, and biological laws that structure the visible dimension. But because they are in the lacuna, because no cognitive framework exists to perceive them, the patterns themselves are invisible. They form, they develop, they grow in complexity, they begin to interact with each other, and they produce effects that propagate outward from the lacuna into the visible dimension. These effects are experienced in the visible world as anomalies, as edge cases, as things that do not quite fit within the existing categorical system. They are the surprise of the six-figure salary at bookies. They are the inexplicable illness before germ theory. They are the uncanny cultural power of a figure who cannot be categorized. They are the signals that something is operating in a dimension that the observer cannot access. And here is the critical point. The edge cases are not errors. They are not noise. They are not random deviations from the norm. They are signals from the lacuna. They are the places where the invisible dimension is pressing against the boundary of the visible, like a child pressing against the wall of the womb, producing visible distortions on the surface that are perceptible to anyone who knows what to look for. The edge case is the signature of a system that is ready to breach the lacuna. And the history of human knowledge, the history of science, the history of technology, the history of cultural revolution is largely the history of individuals who learned to read the edge cases, who recognized that the anomalies were not noise to be discarded, but signals to be followed, who developed cognitive frameworks that could trace the edge cases back through the boundary of the lacuna to the invisible patterns that produced them, and who, in doing so, breached the lacuna and brought a new dimension into the field of the visible. Darwin read the edge cases of the Galapagos finches. Pasteur read the edge cases of spoiled wine and beer. Einstein read the edge case of the photoelectric effect. Watson and Crick read the edge case of Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography. In each case, the breakthrough was not the result of looking harder at what was already visible. It was the result of recognizing that what appeared to be an anomaly within the existing framework was actually a signal from a framework that did not yet exist, a communication from the lacuna, a message from a dimension that was waiting to be perceived. And this is why the current moment is so structurally significant, because we are surrounded by edge cases. The compression algorithm of our civilization is encountering more anomalies, more data points that do not fit within existing categories, more signals from the lacuna than at any previous point in human history. The acceleration of technology, the globalization of information, the democratization of pattern recognition through computational tools, all of these have increased the rate at which edge cases are surfacing. And the question is not whether new dimensions will breach the lacuna. The question is which dimensions, which patterns, which systems will breach first, and who will have the cognitive framework to see them when they do. The actuarial dimension, which is the subject of our next section, is one such system. It has been operating in the lacuna for centuries. Its edge cases are everywhere. The inexplicable premium increase, the mysterious withdrawal of insurance carriers from a state, the baffling correlation between credit score and claims frequency, the eerie precision with which actuarial tables predict the mortality rates of populations. These are signals from a dimension that is pressing against the boundary of ordinary perception, a dimension that contains an invisible government, an invisible economy, an invisible system of classification and control that is more precise, more pervasive, and more consequential than any institution that operates in the visible world. Consider a town, any town, a small city of 40,000 people in the American Southeast, the kind of place you might drive through on your way to somewhere else, registering it, if you register it at all, as a collection of familiar categorical tags. Houses, stores, churches, schools, a main street, some fast food, a Walmart, maybe a hospital. The compression algorithm indexes it in seconds, files it, and clears the bandwidth. Town. You move on. But beneath this surface, beneath the resolution at which ordinary human cognition operates, there exists an architecture so intricate, so pervasive, and so consequential that it functions as an invisible government. This is the underwriting dimension. And to access it is to realize that the town you thought you saw, the town of houses and stores and people going about their lives, is a thin membrane stretched over a structure of risk classification, premium allocation, loss ratio management, and capital reservation that determines, with actuarial precision, who in that town can afford to exist and who cannot. Let us start with what you see when you drive through. You see cars. The compression algorithm fires. Cars. But in the underwriting dimension, every car on that road is a node in a multivariate risk matrix. The make and model of the vehicle determines its theft desirability index and its crash safety rating, both of which feed directly into the premium calculation. The year of the vehicle establishes its depreciation curve, which determines the actual cash value versus the replacement cost, which determines whether the policyholder is adequately insured or is carrying a coverage gap that will become catastrophically visible only in the moment of a loss. The age of the driver, which you cannot see, determines the base rate tier. Drivers under 25 in most states pay premiums that are between 2 and 3 times higher than drivers in the 35 to 55 age band, reflecting actuarial distributions of claims frequency that are remarkably stable across decades of data. The credit score of the driver, which you absolutely cannot see, is, in 47 of 50 states, a permissible rating factor that directly modifies the premium. And the reason it is a permissible rating factor is that actuarial data consistently demonstrates a strong correlation between credit score and claims frequency, a correlation that has been replicated across multiple studies, multiple carriers, and multiple decades, and that exists independent of income level, geographic location, and driving history. What this means, and this is where the invisible government begins to become visible, is that the cost of operating a vehicle, which is in most American communities the non-negotiable prerequisite for economic participation, for getting to work, for accessing healthcare, for purchasing food, for maintaining social connections, This cost is not determined by the sticker price of the car or the price of gasoline. It is determined by a risk classification system that operates entirely in the underwriting dimension, entirely below the threshold of ordinary perception, and that allocates costs based on variables that the driver may not even know are being measured. A 22-year-old with a low credit score driving a 10-year-old sedan in a high claims frequency zip code may be paying annual auto insurance premiums that exceed the book value of the vehicle. That is not a marginal cost. That is a structural barrier to economic participation, and it is completely invisible. It does not appear on the sign outside the used car dealership. It does not appear in the Kelley Blue Book listing. It does not appear anywhere in the visible economy. It operates entirely in the underwriting dimension, and its effects, the restriction of mobility, the reduction of disposable income, the narrowing of employment options, the compression of life possibilities, these effects manifest in the visible world as poverty, as limited opportunity, as the appearance of individual failure, without any visible connection to the actuarial system that produced them. Now, scale this from the individual to the town. Every house in that town is underwritten. The property insurance premium for each house is determined by a convergence of variables that constitutes, in aggregate, a complete socioeconomic X-ray of the community. Construction type, frame, masonry, or mixed. Roof material and age, distance from the nearest fire station and fire hydrant, which determines the public protection classification, a rating developed by the Insurance Services Office that classifies communities on a scale of 1 to 10 based on their fire suppression capabilities, with lower ratings producing lower premiums and higher ratings producing premiums that can make homeownership economically unviable. Flood zone classification, determined by FEMA mapping that assigns each property to a flood risk zone, which determines whether the property requires flood insurance, which is typically purchased through the National Flood Insurance Program at rates that are themselves the product of a political actuarial negotiation between the federal government, the insurance industry, and the real estate development lobby. Wind zone classification, particularly relevant in coastal and southeastern states, where the proximity to the coast produces tiered wind deductibles, often 2 to 5% of the dwelling value, that represent an invisible transfer of catastrophic risk from the insurer to the policyholder. A transfer that most policyholders do not understand until the moment a hurricane makes landfall and they discover that their 5% wind deductible on a $300,000 home means they are responsible for the first $15,000 of wind damage out of pocket. The aggregate of these individual underwriting decisions creates what I call the actuarial topology of the town, an invisible landscape of cost and risk that sits beneath the visible landscape of streets and buildings like a tectonic plate beneath a continent. And this actuarial topology shapes the visible world in ways that are as deterministic as geology, but as invisible as gravity. The areas of the town where insurance costs are lowest attract investment, development, new construction, rising property values, better schools funded by higher property tax revenue, better infrastructure maintained by a stronger municipal tax base. The areas where insurance costs are highest experience disinvestment, deterioration, declining property values, reduced tax revenue, deteriorating schools, deteriorating infrastructure. And because the actuarial topology is invisible, because it operates in a dimension that ordinary perception cannot access, the visible effects of this topology, the difference between the thriving neighborhood and the deteriorating one, are attributed to other causes. They are attributed to the choices of the residents, to the culture of the community, to the quality of the local government, to market forces, to supply and demand. These attributions are not entirely wrong, but they are catastrophically incomplete. They are the JPEG. They are the lossy compression. And the data that has been discarded, the actuarial architecture that is shaping the visible world from beneath, is precisely the data that would reveal the actual mechanism by which certain communities thrive and certain communities do not. This extends into dimensions that most people have never considered. Commercial insurance, the insurance that businesses carry, is itself an invisible determinant of local economic structure. The general liability premium for a small business is determined by the classification code assigned to that business by the insurance industry. And these classification codes carry embedded risk assessments that directly affect the viability of certain types of businesses in certain locations. A restaurant in a high-crime zip code will pay general liability and property premiums that are substantially higher than an identical restaurant in a low-crime zip code, and this premium differential can be the margin between profitability and closure. Workers' compensation rates, which are set by state rating bureaus based on industry classification and loss experience, determine which types of labor-intensive businesses can viably operate in which locations. A construction company in a state with high workers' comp rates for its classification code faces a labor cost structure that is fundamentally different from an identical company in a state with lower rates. And this difference shapes where construction happens, which shapes where development happens, which shapes where people live, which shapes every downstream variable from school quality to life expectancy. And then there is the reinsurance layer, the truly invisible dimension, the dimension behind the dimension. Reinsurance is insurance for insurance companies. It is the mechanism by which primary insurers transfer portions of their risk to global reinsurance markets, markets dominated by a small number of entities: Munich Raye, Swiss Re, Hanover Re, Lloyd's of London syndicates, and a handful of others. The pricing decisions made by these reinsurers, decisions made in offices in Zurich, Munich, London, and Bermuda, decisions based on global catastrophe modeling, climate projections, geopolitical risk assessments, and capital market conditions, these decisions propagate downward through the insurance supply chain and ultimately manifest as changes in the premiums paid by individuals and small businesses in towns across America. A reinsurance price increase triggered by a European flood, a Japanese earthquake, or a shift in global capital allocation can produce a premium increase for a homeowner in Georgia who has no knowledge of and no connection to the triggering event. The homeowner experiences the premium increase as an inexplicable cost, a frustration, a burden. They do not experience it as the terminal manifestation of a global risk transfer chain that connects their roof to the Danube River basin through a series of contractual relationships that exist entirely in the underwriting dimension. This is the invisible government. It does not hold elections. It does not pass laws, though it profoundly influences the laws that are passed, because state insurance regulation is itself a political arena in which the insurance industry, consumer advocates, and state legislators negotiate the terms under which the underwriting dimension is permitted to operate. It does not have a visible headquarters, though its power is concentrated in a remarkably small number of institutions. It does not announce its decisions, though its decisions determine, with a precision that no elected government can match, who can afford to live where, who can afford to drive, who can afford to start a business, who can afford to take a risk, and who is priced out of participation in the economic system entirely. And the most remarkable thing about this invisible government is not its power. It is the fact that its power is exercised through a mechanism, risk classification and premium allocation, that is perceived by the general public not as an exercise of power, but as a neutral, technical, mathematical process. The compression algorithm does not file insurance under government or power or social control. It files insurance under boring, under necessary evil, under something I have to pay but don't think about. And this categorization, this compression, is the most effective camouflage that any system of power has ever achieved. Because the system is not hidden behind a wall, it is not classified, it is not secret. The actuarial tables are public, the rating methodologies are filed with state regulators, the policy forms are standardized, everything is technically visible, and yet the system is as invisible as the microbial dimension was in 1750, because visibility is not a function of accessibility. Visibility is a function of the perceptual framework of the observer. And the perceptual framework of the ordinary person, the person driving through the town, seeing houses and cars and stores, does not contain the categories, the dimensions, the conceptual infrastructure that would be necessary to perceive the actuarial architecture that is governing their life from beneath the surface of every object they see. The underwriting dimension is not a metaphor. It is a literal dimension of reality that contains operational systems of staggering complexity and consequence. And it exists in the dimension lacuna of ordinary human perception, invisible, consequential, and protected from scrutiny by the very compression algorithm that allows people to navigate the visible world without cognitive collapse. The system is not hiding. The system is operating in plain sight. But plain sight is itself a product of the compression algorithm. And the compression algorithm, as we have established, does not show you reality. It shows you a survival-grade rendering of reality. And the rendering, as always, has discarded the dimensions in which the actual power operates. And there is yet another layer beneath even the reinsurance dimension, a layer that reveals how deeply the underwriting architecture penetrates into the most intimate dimensions of human life. Consider health insurance. In the United States, health insurance is the mechanism by which access to medical care is distributed across the population. But health insurance is a compression. What the compression conceals is an actuarial sorting system that categorizes human bodies into risk tiers, assigns economic values to those tiers, and then allocates access to care based on the tier assignment. A person with a pre-existing condition, before the Affordable Care Act's protections, was not merely a person who had a medical history. They were a person whose body had been categorized by the actuarial system into a risk tier that made their coverage either prohibitively expensive or entirely unavailable. The actuarial judgment was not a medical judgment. It was an economic judgment rendered in medical language. And the consequence of that judgment, the inability to access healthcare, was experienced by the individual as a personal misfortune, a cruel twist of fate, an unlucky hand dealt by biology. It was not experienced as what it actually was, a governance decision made by an invisible system that had weighed the economic value of their body against the cost of maintaining it and found the maintenance unprofitable. This extends into occupational risk in ways that are rarely visible to the workers whose lives are shaped by it. The workers' compensation system, in which employers are required to carry insurance that covers medical costs and lost wages for workers injured on the job, is structured around classification codes that assign different premium rates to different types of work. These classification codes contain embedded assumptions about the value of different types of labor and the expendability of different types of workers. The premium rate for clerical office work is a fraction of the premium rate for construction, which reflects the differential risk of injury, but also embeds a differential economic valuation of the worker. The office worker's body is insured at a rate that reflects its low risk of injury and its high economic productivity. The construction worker's body is insured at a rate that reflects its high risk of injury and, implicitly, its lower economic irreplaceability. These are not neutral actuarial calculations. They are economic valuations of human bodies rendered in the language of risk classification. And they operate entirely in the underwriting dimension, entirely below the threshold of ordinary perception, shaping the economic viability of entire industries, the geographic distribution of employment, and the life trajectories of millions of workers who have no awareness that their bodies have been categorized, valued, and priced by a system they cannot see. The underwriting dimension also intersects with climate change in ways that are beginning to breach the dimension lacuna, producing the first faint signals that the invisible architecture may be becoming partially visible. Insurance companies are, by institutional necessity, among the most sophisticated assessors of climate risk on Earth. They have been modeling catastrophic weather events, tracking changes in storm frequency and severity, and adjusting their exposure to climate-sensitive regions for decades. And these adjustments are beginning to manifest in the visible world in ways that are difficult to ignore. When a major insurance carrier withdraws from a state market, as several have done in California and Florida in recent years, the effects cascade through the visible economy. Property values decline, mortgage lending contracts because lenders require insurance, construction slows, businesses relocate, tax revenue falls, public services deteriorate. These cascading effects are visible, but their origin, the actuarial decision to withdraw, is made in the underwriting dimension based on catastrophe modeling and reinsurance pricing that operates in the dimension lacuna of public perception. The homeowner in Florida who can no longer obtain affordable property insurance is experiencing the terminal manifestation of a global climate risk assessment conducted by reinsurers in Zurich and catastrophe modelers in London, filtered through the regulatory apparatus of the State Insurance Commissioner's Office, and delivered to the homeowner as a premium increase or a non-renewal notice that provides no explanation of the dimensional architecture that produced it. This is the underwriting dimension in its full scope. It is not a sector. It is not an industry. It is a dimension of reality that contains governance systems of extraordinary precision and consequence, systems that determine who can participate in the economy and on what terms, systems that price human bodies, communities, and geographic regions into tiers of viability and expendability, systems that respond to global phenomena like climate change and geopolitical instability with a speed and granularity that no democratic institution can match. And it is invisible. Not because it is secret, because it is boring, because the compression algorithm files it under insurance and terminates the investigation, because the most powerful camouflage a system can have is the appearance of mundanity. And insurance, in the perceptual architecture of ordinary human cognition, is the most mundane thing in the world. Up to this point, we have been examining how the compression algorithm renders systems invisible, and how the dimension lacuna contains operative realities that shape human life without human awareness. But now we must turn to something more structurally radical. We must examine what happens when someone actually breaches the lacuna, when someone builds a cognitive framework capable of perceiving a dimension that was previously invisible, and more importantly, we must examine the specific cognitive posture, the specific relationship to categories and systems that makes such a breach possible. Because the breach does not come from deeper expertise within an existing category, it comes from the space between categories, it comes from liminality. Peter Shor is a mathematician at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who, in 1994, accomplished something that the global cybersecurity establishment had considered effectively impossible. He developed an algorithm, now universally known as Shor's algorithm, that can factor large integers in polynomial time when executed on a quantum computer. The implications of this achievement cannot be overstated without considerable effort, because the entire infrastructure of modern digital security, the encryption that protects banking transactions, military communications, medical records, government secrets, cryptocurrency, and virtually every piece of sensitive information transmitted electronically rests on the mathematical assumption that factoring large integers is computationally intractable. RSA encryption, the standard that has secured the digital world since the 1970s, works because multiplying two large prime numbers together is trivially easy, but determining which two prime numbers were multiplied together to produce a given product is, for classical computers, effectively impossible when the primes are sufficiently large. The entire system depends on this asymmetry. Shor's algorithm destroys that asymmetry. And in destroying it, it threatens to render the entire architecture of digital security obsolete. But the relevant question for our purposes is not what Shor's algorithm does, it is how Shor was able to see it. What cognitive posture, what perceptual framework, what relationship to existing categories allowed Shor to perceive something that the entire global mathematics and computer science establishment had not perceived. And the answer, when you examine it closely, is liminality. Shor's algorithm is not the product of deeper expertise within number theory. It is not the product of deeper expertise within quantum physics. It is the product of a mind that was operating between those two categories in the dimensional space that opens up when the boundaries between established categories are traversed rather than respected. To understand this, you need to understand what quantum computing itself represents in the framework we have been building. Quantum computing is, in the most literal sense, a dimensional breach. Classical computing operates within a dimensional space defined by binary states, 0 and 1, on and off, true and false. Every computation that a classical computer performs is a manipulation of these binary states. And within this dimensional space, certain problems, including the factoring of large integers, are computationally intractable because the number of operations required grows exponentially with the size of the input. The dimensional space of classical computation simply does not have enough room to solve the problem efficiently. Quantum computing breaches this dimensional limitation by accessing a new dimension, superposition. In superposition, a quantum bit, or qubit, does not exist in a binary state of 0 or 1. It exists in a probabilistic combination of both states simultaneously. This is not a metaphor. This is the physical reality of quantum mechanics, a reality that Richard Feynman, among others, recognized could be exploited for computation. And by exploiting this additional dimension, quantum computers can perform certain types of calculations in ways that are structurally impossible for classical computers, not because quantum computers are faster, but because they operate in a larger dimensional space. Shor's genius was not in understanding quantum mechanics. Many physicists understood quantum mechanics. It was not in understanding number theory. Many mathematicians understood number theory. Shor's genius was in seeing that a specific property of quantum mechanics, the behavior of periodic functions in superposition, could be mapped onto a specific problem in number theory, the factoring of integers, through a framework that required simultaneous fluency in both domains and a willingness to occupy the liminal space between them. The insight could not have originated from within either domain alone. A pure number theorist, operating entirely within the categorical boundaries of mathematics, would not have perceived the quantum mechanical property that enabled the algorithm. A pure quantum physicist, operating entirely within the categorical boundaries of physics, would not have perceived the number theoretic structure that the quantum property could exploit. The insight required a mind that was categorically homeless, a mind that refused to be fully absorbed by either domain, a mind that was operating in the space between systems. And this is the structural principle that connects Shor's algorithm to everything we have been building. The space between categories is not empty. The space between categories is where new dimensions become visible. The boundaries between established categories are not merely administrative conveniences that organize knowledge into manageable compartments. They are perceptual barriers that prevent the observer from seeing patterns that span multiple categorical domains. When you respect the boundary between physics and mathematics, you can see everything that exists within physics and everything that exists within mathematics. But you cannot see the patterns that form across the boundary, the patterns that exist in neither domain individually, but emerge only when the domains are superimposed upon each other. These cross-domain patterns are in the dimension lacuna. They are operational, they are consequential, and they are invisible to anyone who respects the categorical boundaries. This is why interdisciplinary work is not merely a nice-to-have addition to academic research. It is the mechanism by which dimensional breaches occur. Every major paradigm shift in the history of science has involved the traversal of categorical boundaries. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection required the simultaneous integration of geology, the deep time framework that Charles Lyell provided, with zoology, botany, and what would later become genetics. Einstein's general relativity required the integration of physics with Riemannian geometry, a branch of mathematics that had been developed decades earlier with no application to physics in mind. The discovery of DNA's structure by Watson and Crick required the integration of X-ray crystallography, organic chemistry, and biology. In each case, the breakthrough did not emerge from going deeper within a single categorical domain. It emerged from the liminal space between domains, from the dimensional territory that is accessible only to minds that refuse to be categorized. And this is the principle that allows us to connect quantum computing and cybersecurity to something that seems, on the surface, entirely unrelated, the cultural power of figures who operate in liminality. Because the same structural principle that allowed Shor to see across the boundary between physics and mathematics, the same principle that allows interdisciplinary researchers to perceive patterns that disciplinary specialists cannot, operates in every domain of human experience, including culture, identity, art, and power. Consider what happens when a cultural figure refuses to be categorized, when an artist operates between genres, when a person inhabits multiple identity categories simultaneously without being fully absorbed by any of them, when someone moves between social worlds, class worlds, aesthetic worlds, without settling permanently in any one. What happens is structurally identical to what happens when a researcher operates between academic disciplines. New patterns become visible, new information emerges, new combinations become possible that are impossible within any single category. And the products of this liminality, the art, the ideas, the performances, the cultural objects that emerge from the space between categories, have a quality that is immediately recognizable even when it cannot be easily named. They feel new, they feel surprising. They feel like they come from somewhere that the existing categorical system cannot account for. They feel, in a word, magical. And this is not accidental. The feeling of magic is the phenomenological signature of a dimensional breach. When you encounter something that your categorical system cannot contain, something that does not fit within any existing tag, something that exists in the space between your categories and forces you to perceive a dimension you did not previously have access to, the subjective experience of that encounter is wonder, surprise, the uncanny feeling of encountering something that should not exist within the reality you know. This is why liminality produces cultural power. Not because there is anything inherently valuable about being uncategorizable, but because uncategorizability is the phenomenological signature of operating in a dimension that the observer's compression algorithm cannot process. And the inability to process, the failure of the compression algorithm, the moment when the categorical tag refuses to fire and the mind is confronted with the raw, uncompressed complexity of what it is perceiving, that moment is experienced as power, as charisma, as magic, as genius. Shor experienced this in mathematics. The global cybersecurity establishment experienced it as an existential threat, a sudden revelation that the dimensional space they had assumed was complete. The binary computational universe in which RSA encryption was unbreakable was in fact a lossy compression of a larger reality. And the same structural dynamic, the same relationship between categorical boundaries, liminality, and the emergence of new dimensional information operates at every scale of human experience. It operates in music, it operates in fashion, it operates in identity politics, it operates in urban geography, it operates in the architecture of financial regulation, and it operates, as we will see, in the specific, historically contingent, deeply strange intersection of institutions that constitutes the invisible system at the heart of British power. And the implications extend far beyond RSA encryption, elliptic curve cryptography, the mathematical framework that underpins blockchain technology, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the entire decentralized finance ecosystem rests on a related computational asymmetry, the difficulty of the discrete logarithm problem on elliptic curves. Shor's algorithm, or variations of it adapted for the elliptic curve context, threatens this asymmetry as well, which means that the entire architecture of cryptocurrency, an architecture that was explicitly designed to operate outside the regulatory reach of sovereign governments and central banks, an architecture that positions itself as the financial system of the future, is built on a mathematical assumption that a single quantum algorithm, conceived by a mind operating in the liminal space between physics and mathematics, has already demonstrated to be theoretically breakable. The blockchain community calls this the quantum threat, and the field of post-quantum cryptography, the effort to develop encryption methods that are resistant to quantum computation, is one of the most active and urgent research areas in contemporary computer science. But what is structurally significant for our framework is not the technical details of the threat. It is the fact that the threat originates from liminality. The most powerful computational systems in the world, systems that nations and industries and entire financial ecosystems depend upon for their security, are vulnerable, not to a more powerful version of themselves, but to a fundamentally different kind of computation, a computation that operates in a dimensional space that classical computation cannot access, a computation that emerged from a mind that refused to stay within the boundaries of a single discipline. This is the pattern, and it is the same pattern everywhere. The vulnerability is not at the center of any system. The vulnerability is at the edge, at the boundary, at the place where one system meets another, where one category bleeds into the next, where the compression algorithm cannot fire a clean tag because the entity it is encountering does not fit within a single category. This is true in cryptography. It is true in cultural production. It is true in institutional power. It is true in the architecture of cities and nations. The power is always at the boundary. The innovation is always at the intersection. The breach is always liminal. And this has implications that extend well beyond the technical domain of cryptography and computation. Consider the structure of the modern university, which is itself an exercise in categorical organization. The university is divided into departments: physics, mathematics, biology, chemistry, economics, political science, sociology, philosophy. Each department defines a categorical domain. Each domain has its own methods, its own journals, its own conferences, its own career ladders, its own criteria for tenure. And the boundaries between these departments are not merely administrative conveniences, they are epistemic barriers. They determine what counts as a valid question, what counts as a valid method, what counts as a valid answer within each domain. A political scientist who uses the methods of physics is not doing political science. A biologist who uses the frameworks of philosophy is not doing biology. The boundaries are policed, and the policing is not incidental. It is constitutive. It is what makes each discipline what it is, and it is what prevents each discipline from seeing the patterns that form across the boundaries. This is why the most transformative intellectual developments of the past century have, almost without exception, originated from scholars who refuse to respect departmental boundaries. Cognitive science emerged from the intersection of psychology, linguistics, philosophy, computer science, and neuroscience. Behavioral economics emerged from the intersection of psychology and economics, a merger that was so categorically transgressive that it was initially dismissed by both parent disciplines before eventually winning multiple Nobel Prizes. Network science emerged from the intersection of mathematics, sociology, and computer science. Bioinformatics emerged from the intersection of biology and computer science. In every case, the disciplinary establishment initially resisted the cross-boundary work because the work did not fit within any existing category, and the categorical system of the academy, like every categorical system, is designed to contain, to classify, and to regulate, not to accommodate the unclassifiable. The resistance eventually gave way, not because the establishment became more open-minded, but because the insights generated by the liminal work were so powerful, so consequential, so undeniable, that the categorical system was forced to expand to contain them, creating new departments, new journals, new conferences, new categories that could house what the liminality had produced. But here's the critical structural point. Once the new category was created, once the liminal insight was contained and classified, the generative power of the liminality was diminished. Cognitive science, once a radical interdisciplinary insurgency, became a department. Behavioral economics, once a categorical impossibility, became a subfield with its own textbooks and tenure tracks. The liminality was absorbed, the boundary was moved, and the system, having expanded to contain the new category, resumed its normal function of preventing observation across the new boundaries it had created. The power of liminality is temporary at the institutional level. It exists only as long as the entity remains uncategorized. Once categorization occurs, the power migrates to the next liminal space, the next boundary, the next gap in the categorical system. This is why the power structure can never be permanently destabilized by any single insight, any single discipline, any single dimensional breach. The system absorbs the breach, creates a new category to contain it, and reconstitutes itself around the new boundaries. The compression algorithm updates, the JPEG recalibrates, and the dimension lacuna shifts, contracting in the area of the breach, but persisting, always persisting, in the infinite number of remaining boundaries that have not yet been traversed. But before we go there, we must first examine the figure who has made liminality itself into an art form, a life practice, and an engine of cultural power that defies every categorical system that has attempted to contain it. We must examine Michel Lamy, because Lamy is not merely an example of liminality. Lamy is the living proof that liminality is a technology of power, a technology of dimensional breach, and a technology that, when operated with sufficient skill, produces a form of influence that no existing category can explain because it originates from outside the categorical system entirely. There is a woman who has blackened teeth, gilded fingers, face tattoos that predate the era in which face tattoos became subcultural currency, and a voice that sounds like it is being transmitted from a dimension adjacent to this one. She is not a fashion designer, though she has shaped fashion more profoundly than most designers. She is not an architect, though she has conceived and inhabited spaces that redefine the relationship between the human body and the built environment. She is not a musician, though she has performed, produced, and instigated sonic events that exist outside any recognizable genre classification. She is not a restaurateur, though she ran one of the most culturally significant restaurants in 1980s Paris, and later co-created the concept that became Rick Owens's retail universe. She is not a philosopher, though her practice of living constitutes one of the most rigorous and sustained experiments in anti-categorical existence that the contemporary world has produced. Her name is Michel Lamy, and she is the living embodiment of the structural principle we established in the previous section, that the space between categories is not empty, that operating in liminality generates a form of power that the categorical system cannot process, and that this unprocessability is experienced by observers as something approaching the alchemical. To understand what Michel Lamy represents within the framework we are building, you must first understand what she refuses. She refuses to be a single thing. Not as a strategy, not as a brand position, not as a conscious act of contrarianism, but as an ontological posture, a way of being in the world that is as fundamental to her as breathing. Every attempt to categorize Lamy fails, and the failures are not incidental. They are structural. They reveal the limitations of the categorical system that is attempting to contain her. When a fashion journalist calls her Rick Owens' partner, the category captures something real, but discards the dimensions in which Lamy operates as an independent creative force whose influence on Owens is so pervasive and so foundational that the entity known as Rick Owens is arguably unintelligible without her. When an art publication calls her an artist, the category captures the aesthetic dimension, but discards the entrepreneurial, the culinary, the architectural, the social engineering dimensions of her practice. When a lifestyle publication calls her a muse, the category reduces a generative agent to a passive inspiration, a thing that is looked at rather than a force that acts. Every category captures a facet and discards the rest. And the rest is where Lamy actually lives. This is what makes Lamy structurally significant for our argument. She is not significant because she is interesting, though she is. She is not significant because she is famous, though she has a specific concentrated form of fame. She is significant because her existence constitutes a continuously running experiment in what happens when a human being refuses to be compressed. She is a walking, breathing, gold-fingered demonstration of the proposition that the compression algorithm is not a natural law but a social technology, and that it can be refused. And the consequences of that refusal are precisely what our framework would predict. She generates power that the categorical system cannot explain. She produces cultural effects that cannot be attributed to any single domain of activity. And she exists in the perceptual field of observers as an irreducible anomaly, a figure who, because she cannot be categorized, cannot be dismissed, cannot be processed, and cannot be ignored, despite operating at a scale that is minuscule compared to the cultural industries that surround her. Lamy's biography is itself a study in categorical traversal. Born in the 1940s in France, studied law, moved into the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, where she engaged with avant-garde theater, operated boxing gyms as social spaces, and moved between the worlds of Parisian intellectualism and street-level physicality. In the 1980s, she opened Les Deux Cafés in Paris, a restaurant that functioned less as a dining establishment and more as a salon, a gathering point for artists, musicians, designers, and cultural figures who recognized in the space something that defied commercial categorization. The restaurant was not simply a place to eat. It was a social technology, a space designed to produce encounters between people who would not otherwise encounter each other, a space whose value was not in its cuisine, but in its liminality, its refusal to be merely a restaurant. And then there is her relationship with Rick Owens, which began in the early 90s and which has produced one of the most distinctive aesthetic universes in contemporary fashion. But the nature of her role within that universe defies every available category. She is not the designer. Owens designs the clothes. She is not the businesswoman. There are executives who manage the business. She is not the creative director. That title belongs to Owens. What she is, as nearly as any categorical system can approximate, is the generative atmosphere. She is the context in which Owens's work becomes possible. She is the dimensional space in which his aesthetic exists. And this is not a metaphor. Owens himself has described her influence in terms that consistently reach for language beyond the categorical. She is the energy. She is the force. She is the thing that cannot be named, but without which the thing that can be named would not exist. This is alchemy in the most precise sense available to us. Not the medieval practice of attempting to transmute base metals into gold, but the structural principle that underlies that practice. The proposition that transformation occurs at the boundaries between categories, in the liminal space where one substance ceases to be what it was and has not yet become what it will be. The alchemical tradition, when you strip away its pre-scientific chemistry, is a theory of liminality. The philosopher's stone, the legendary substance that supposedly enabled transmutation, was not a physical object but a conceptual device, a framework for thinking about what happens when categorical boundaries dissolve. And Lamy, whether she is conscious of this or not, whether she would use these terms or not, is operating according to the alchemical principle. She dissolves categorical boundaries. She exists in the space between things, and in that space, transmutation occurs. Things become other things. A restaurant becomes a salon becomes an aesthetic universe becomes a form of power. And the power is real. This is the part that the categorical system cannot process, and therefore cannot explain. Lamy commands attention, respect, and influence that is entirely disproportionate to her institutional position. She holds no title that would, within the categorical system, warrant the influence she wields. She controls no budget. She manages no organization. She produces no product that can be sold, measured, or evaluated according to commercial metrics. And yet, she is one of the most influential figures in contemporary fashion, not because she does fashion, but because she does something that fashion does not have a category for. And the absence of a category means the absence of containment. And the absence of containment means that her influence operates in a dimensional space that the industry's sorting mechanisms cannot reach, cannot modulate, and cannot suppress. This is the mechanism. Liminality generates power because power, in the framework we have been building, is fundamentally a function of the relationship between an entity and the categorical system that attempts to contain it. When an entity fits neatly within a category, the system can contain it. It can be measured, compared, ranked, regulated, and ultimately controlled because the category provides the coordinates by which the system locates and manages the entity. But when an entity exists between categories, the system cannot contain it because the system can only contain what it can categorize. The uncategorizable entity operates in a dimensional space that is, from the system's perspective, in the lacuna. It is there. It is exerting influence. It is producing effects. But the system cannot see it, cannot locate it, cannot apply its containment mechanisms to it. And this inability to contain is experienced by both the system and its observers as power. This is why every major cultural disruption in history has originated from figures or movements that existed in categorical liminality. The Impressionists were neither academic painters nor folk artists. They existed between the categories of fine art and everyday visual experience, and in that liminality they generated an aesthetic revolution that forced the art world to create new categories. Jazz emerged from the liminality between African musical traditions and European harmonic frameworks, between sacred and secular, between composition and improvisation, and in that liminality it generated a musical form so powerful that it restructured the entire global music industry. Hip-hop emerged from the liminality between spoken word, funk, soul, and street culture, and in that liminality it generated the dominant cultural form of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In every case, the power came not from mastery within a category, but from the refusal or inability to be contained by a category. And Lamy is perhaps the purest living example of this principle, because unlike the Impressionists or the pioneers of jazz or hip-hop, she has never solidified into a new category. She has never become a genre. She has never been successfully classified and thereby contained. She remains liminal. She remains between. And because she remains between, she remains powerful in a way that the categorical system cannot diminish, cannot replicate, and cannot explain. She is, in the most precise sense, a singularity within the cultural system, a point at which the normal rules of categorical containment break down and something else, something that the system can only experience as magic or alchemy, takes their place. But to fully understand what Lamy represents, we must push further into the concept of alchemy itself, because alchemy is not merely a convenient metaphor here. It is a structural description of the process by which liminality generates power. The alchemical tradition, when you strip away the pre-scientific chemistry and the mystical symbolism, is fundamentally concerned with a specific type of transformation, the transformation that occurs when a substance is placed in a state of dissolution, when its categorical identity is suspended, when it exists in the liminal space between what it was and what it will become. The alchemists called this state the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution of form. And they understood that it was only in this state, only when categorical identity had been suspended, that genuine transformation, the emergence of something new, could occur. The philosopher's stone was not a substance that could be applied to lead to turn it into gold. It was a principle, a framework for understanding that transformation requires the dissolution of categories, that the new can only emerge from the space between the old categories, that creation requires destruction, that form requires the prior dissolution of form. Lamy lives in the nigredo. She has made the dissolution of categorical identity not a phase to be passed through on the way to a new identity, but a permanent state of being. And the power this generates is not the power of novelty, which is temporary, or the power of fame, which is contingent on the attention economy, or the power of wealth, which is denominated in currency. It is the power of inexplicability, the power of confronting observers with something they cannot process, cannot file, cannot dismiss, and therefore cannot stop thinking about. It is the power of the cognitive glitch, the moment when the compression algorithm encounters an input. It cannot compress, and the mind, unable to fire a categorical tag and move on, is forced to remain with the input, to attend to it, to give it the kind of sustained cognitive attention that compressed entities never receive. This is why Lamy photographs differently from other figures in fashion. When she appears in a photograph, the image resists the rapid scrolling, the instantaneous categorization, the glance and dismiss rhythm that characterizes contemporary image consumption. The image stops you, not because it is beautiful in the conventional sense, not because it is shocking in the deliberately provocative sense, but because it cannot be immediately categorized. The mind reaches for a tag. Fashion designer, socialite, artist, matriarch, witch, shaman, icon. Each tag partially applies, none fully applies. And in the gap between partial application and full application, in the space where the tag refuses to settle, attention persists. The image remains in consciousness longer than it should. And this extended dwell time, this refusal of the compression algorithm to complete its work, is the phenomenological experience of encountering liminality. It is the feeling of standing at the edge of the dimension lacuna and sensing that there is something on the other side that the existing categorical system cannot show you. This has implications that extend far beyond the specific case of Michel Lamy, because what Lamy demonstrates at the individual scale, the proposition that refusing to be categorized generates a form of power that categorized entities cannot access, is a principle that operates at every scale of human organization. It operates in art, where the most enduring works are those that resist genre classification. It operates in business, where the most disruptive companies are those that create new categories rather than competing within existing ones. It operates in politics, where the most transformative movements are those that cannot be placed on the existing ideological spectrum. And it operates in the specific, historically layered, institutionally dense ecosystem of London, where the power of liminality has been exploited, cultivated, and institutionalized on a scale that makes individual figures like Lamy look like proof-of-concept demonstrations for a much larger system. And this is the bridge to what comes next. Because Lamy is a small-scale example, a single human being operating in liminality within the specific domain of fashion and art. But the structural principle she embodies, the principle that liminality generates power, that the space between categories is where new dimensions become visible, that uncategorizability is itself a technology of influence. This principle operates at every scale. It operates at the scale of individual artists. It operates at the scale of musical genres. It operates at the scale of academic disciplines. And it operates, as we will now see, at the scale of entire cultural industrial educational systems. Systems that have learned, whether consciously or through institutional evolution, to exploit the power of liminality on a scale that makes Lamy look like a demonstration model. And the most concentrated, most historically layered, most structurally sophisticated example of institutional liminality on Earth exists in a specific geographic location, operates through a specific set of interconnected institutions, and has produced a specific set of cultural figures whose power is, as we will demonstrate, directly attributable to the liminal architecture that produced them. That location is London. Those institutions include the Brit School, the West End theatre ecosystem, the Lloyd's insurance market, and the regulatory architecture of the City of London. And the cultural figures they have produced include Raye, Olivia Dean, and FKA Twigs. There are three women in British music who, when examined individually, appear to be three separate artists with three separate stories. But when examined through the decompressive framework we have been building, when the compression algorithm is suspended and the full dimensional space is allowed to unfold, what becomes visible is not three individuals, but a single system. A system that produces a specific type of cultural figure, a figure whose power derives from liminality, whose liminality is not accidental, but is the product of specific institutional, geographic, demographic, and economic conditions unique to London, and whose emergence into global cultural visibility represents the system learning, iteration by iteration, how to harvest the power that forms in the space between categories. Begin with Raye, born Rachel Agatha Keane in 1997 in Tooting, South London. Her father is a British man of Swiss and English heritage. Her mother is a Ghanaian Swiss woman. She is biracial, which, in the specific context of London, a city whose racial demography and racial politics are profoundly different from those of the United States, positions her in a particular form of liminality. She is neither fully within the white British cultural mainstream, nor fully within the black British or West African diaspora community. She exists between. But this is only the first layer of her liminality. She attended the Britty School, the tuition-free performing arts school in Croydon that has produced an extraordinary density of globally successful artists. Adele, Amy Winehouse, Jessie J, FKA Twigs, and others. The Brit School is itself a liminal institution, occupying a categorical space between state education and performing arts conservatory, between working-class accessibility via free tuition and elite-level artistic training, between the formal curriculum and the informal creative ecosystem that forms among students who are, by virtue of the school's selection process, already predisposed to categorical nonconformity. Raye's early career placed her in yet another form of liminality, one that proved to be creatively devastating before it became revelatory. She signed to Polydor Records as a teenager and spent years being positioned as a pop dance vocalist, writing hooks for other artists, providing top lines for EDM producers, functioning as a component in a commercial music machinery that valued her voice as a raw material but did not have a category for the full scope of what she could do. She existed in the liminality between pop, dance, R&B, and the confessional singer-songwriter tradition, and the industry's categorical system could not resolve this liminality into a coherent commercial identity. The result was paralysis. Albums were shelved, singles were released and abandoned. Creative work was produced and then suppressed because it did not fit the category that the label had assigned. And then in 2021, she publicly confronted the label system that had contained her. She posted on social media that Polydor had refused to release her debut album. The post went viral. She was released from her contract. And the album she subsequently produced, My 21st Century Blues, released in 2023, was not the album that the categorical system had been trying to extract from her. It was the album that the liminality itself had produced. It was an album that moved between confessional balladry, orchestral pop, drum and bass, spoken word, theatrical staging, and raw emotional disclosure in a way that no existing genre category could contain. It was an album that sounded like the space between categories, and it was one of the most critically acclaimed and commercially successful debut albums of its year, winning 6 Brit Awards, a feat that is structurally explicable only when you understand that the power of the album derived not from its conformity to any genre, but from its categorical uncontainability. Now, examine Olivia Dean. Born in 1999 in London to a biracial family with a black mother of Windrush generation Jamaican heritage and a white English father who is a barrister. This is a specific and significant configuration of liminalities. The Windrush generation, the wave of Caribbean immigrants who arrived in Britain from the late 1940s through the early 1970s at the explicit invitation of the British government to fill post-war labor shortages, occupies a deeply contested position in British cultural identity. They are foundational to modern multicultural Britain, yet they have been subject to systematic institutional hostility, most visibly in the Windrush scandal of 2018, in which the Home Office wrongfully classified long-term legal residents as illegal immigrants. Dean's maternal heritage places her within this specific history of belonging and exclusion, a foundational contribution and institutional betrayal. But her paternal heritage places her simultaneously within the professional class British establishment. A barrister's daughter has access to cultural codes, social networks, linguistic registers, and institutional fluency that are the markers of a specific class position in British society. Dean can code switch not merely between racial identities, but between class identities. She can navigate the precarious, economically deprived world of the London indie music scene, where musicians perform in small venues for minimal pay in one of the most expensive cities on earth. And she can navigate the professional, credentialed, institutionally fluent world of her father's social class. This dual fluency is itself a form of liminality, and it manifests directly in her artistic output. Dean attended the British School, the same liminal institution that produced Raye, and she was trained in musical theater. This is a detail that the compression algorithm of music journalism typically discards as biographical background, but it is structurally essential. Musical theater is a discipline that trains practitioners in a specific set of skills that are deeply relevant to the form of liminality we are examining. Musical theater trains you to inhabit characters, to shift between identities, to perform emotion with precision and intentionality rather than merely expressing it spontaneously. It trains you in the mechanics of costume, of staging, of the visual presentation of self as a deliberate construction rather than an authentic expression. And it trains you in genre fluency, because musical theater is itself a liminal art form that incorporates spoken word, song, dance, orchestral arrangement, set design, costume design, and narrative structure into a unified performance. Dean's musical output reflects this training in ways that are invisible unless you know to look for them. Her movement between the queer, boyish, androgynous aesthetic of the London indie theater scene and the hyper-feminine aesthetic of a more commercially polished R&B artist is not a random oscillation. It is a performed code switch, a deliberate traversal of gender and aesthetic categories that derives directly from her musical theater training in character inhabitation. The ease with which she shifts suggests that the shift is natural. And it is natural in the sense that she has been trained in it, but it is not natural in the sense that it happens without craft. It happens with the precision of a performer who has learned to move between worlds, and the cultural power it generates is the same structural phenomenon we identified in the previous sections, the phenomenological signature of dimensional breach, the feeling of encountering something that does not fit within existing categories, the experience of seeing something operate in a space that the observer's compression algorithm cannot process. Her musical genre is itself liminal. She operates in a space that has only recently begun to be tentatively categorized as indie soul, a term that is itself an acknowledgement of the categorical system's inability to contain what she does. She draws on black gospel and soul traditions that are part of her maternal heritage, on institutionally trained vocal technique and songwriting craft from the Brit School, on the intimate, confessional register of the British indie folk tradition, and on the theatricality of her musical theater training. The result is a body of work that feels both deeply personal and carefully constructed, both raw and polished, both culturally specific and universally accessible. It exists between categories, and it generates power from that existence. Now examine FKA Twigs. Born Talia Debrett Barnett in 1988 in Cheltenham, a predominantly white market town in the English Cotswolds, to a half-Jamaican, half-Spanish mother and a white English father. If Dean's liminality is a dual fluency navigated with relative comfort, Twigs's liminality is a more fraught and combative negotiation. Growing up biracial in a predominantly white small town produced a fundamental experience of not fitting, of being visible precisely because the categorical system of the community could not process her presence without friction. Her subsequent relocation to London and immersion in the South London dance and performance art scene introduced a second set of categories: Black British urban culture, avant-garde performance art, contemporary dance, and the visual aesthetics of haute couture. And she moved between these with a ferocity and a deliberateness that transformed the experience of categorical displacement into an artistic methodology. Twigs's training in dance, particularly in classical and contemporary forms, gave her a physical vocabulary that exists between the codified movement systems of formal dance and the improvisational body-centered expression of club culture. Her visual presentation is between high fashion and ritual, between the editorial aesthetics of a Vogue cover and the ceremonial aesthetics of a sacred performance. Her music is between electronic production, avant-R&B, and art pop in a way that refuses to settle in any of these categories. And the critical response to her work consistently reaches for language that reflects the observer's confrontation with the limits of their categorical system: otherworldly, alien, ethereal, impossible to categorize. These are not descriptions of the music. They are descriptions of the observer's experience of encountering something that occupies a dimension their compression algorithm cannot access. What connects these three artists is not merely that they are biracial, or that they attended the Brit School, or that they operate in liminal genre spaces, though all of these things are true. What connects them is that they are products of a specific system, a system that is unique to London and that produces liminality at industrial scale. The system is constituted by the intersection of several institutional and demographic conditions that exist nowhere else in precisely this configuration. First, London's demographic liminality. London is a city in which no single racial or ethnic group constitutes an overwhelming majority. The white British population of London is approximately 37%, making London one of the most racially diverse major cities in the world. But London's diversity is not the melting pot diversity of American cities like New York or Los Angeles, where the metaphor is one of assimilation into a common identity. London's diversity is more accurately described as a coexistence of distinct but overlapping cultural worlds, worlds that are geographically proximate but culturally distinct, that share public spaces but maintain separate institutional, social, and cultural architectures. This produces a specific type of liminality, the liminality of adjacency, of living between worlds that are physically close but categorically separate, of navigating the boundaries between them as a daily practice. Second, the Brit School as a liminal institution, a tuition-free performing arts school that draws students from across London's class and racial spectrum, that provides elite-level training in a deliberately interdisciplinary environment, and that operates in the liminal space between state education and conservatory, between working-class accessibility and artistic elitism. The school is a factory of liminality. It takes young people who are already predisposed to categorical nonconformity, places them in an environment that actively rewards cross-categorical exploration, and produces artists who are trained to move between worlds. The density of globally significant artists produced by a single institution with an annual intake of roughly 300 students is statistically extraordinary and is explicable only when you understand the institution as a liminality engine. Third, the economic precarity of the London arts ecosystem. London is one of the most expensive cities on earth. The cost of housing, transportation, food, and basic survival in London is so high that pursuing an artistic career in the city is an act of sustained economic irrationality for anyone without independent financial support. This produces a specific demographic filter. The artists who survive in London's independent music and performance scene are disproportionately those who have access to some form of class privilege, whether through family wealth, professional class parents, or the social capital that comes from educational credentials that allows them to endure the years of economic precarity that the scene demands. This means that the artists who emerge from this ecosystem are disproportionately those who exist in the liminality between economic precarity and class privilege, between the creative working class and the credentialed professional class. And this class liminality, layered on top of the racial, genre, and institutional liminalities already described, produces a multiplicative effect, a compounding of liminal dimensions that generates cultural products of extraordinary categorical complexity. This is the system. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a deliberate design. It is an emergent property of the specific institutional, demographic, economic, and geographic conditions of London. But it is a system nonetheless, and it produces a specific type of cultural output. Art that operates between categories, that generates power from its uncontainability, that is experienced by audiences as fresh, surprising, authentic, and innovative precisely because it originates from a dimensional space that the audience's compression algorithm cannot process. And the music industry, after decades of trying to contain these liminal figures within existing categorical frameworks, pop, R&B, dance, indie, and failing, has finally begun to learn what the framework we have been building would predict, that the liminality itself is the product, that the space between categories is where the value is generated, that the power does not come from fitting into a genre, but from the failure to fit, and that this failure, when it is the product of genuine dimensional complexity rather than artificial pose, is worth more than any amount of categorical conformity. But this is only the surface. The Brit School pipeline, the London music scene, the careers of Raye and Dean and Twigs, these are the visible manifestations of a much deeper and much older system. A system that has been operating in London for centuries. A system that exploits the power of liminality not merely in culture, but in finance, in law, in governance, in the very structure of how capital and power flow through the United Kingdom. And to see that system, we must go deeper still. We must go to Lloyd's. We must go to the City of London. We must go to the places where liminality has been institutionalized, formalized, and weaponized at a scale that makes the music industry look like a proof of concept. There is a square mile in the center of London that is not, in any meaningful legal, political, or constitutional sense, part of the city that surrounds it. The City of London, which must be distinguished from London the metropolis, is a medieval jurisdiction that predates the English monarchy, that has its own government, its own police force, its own electoral system, its own ceremonial lord, and a constitutional status so anomalous that it cannot be accurately described using any conventional political category. It is not a city, it is not a borough, it is not a county, it is not a nation-state, though it has some of the features of one. It is not a corporation, though it is formally called the City of London Corporation and functions in many respects as one. It is, in the most precise language available, a sui generis entity, a thing that exists in a category of one, a thing that the categorical system of British and international governance has never successfully absorbed, classified, or contained. It is, in the terminology of our framework, a structural liminality that has been operating continuously for nearly 1,000 years. And the power it has generated from that liminality is, when you decompress it from the bland categorical tag of financial district, one of the most extraordinary concentrations of systemic influence on Earth. The City of London's constitutional liminality is not a historical curiosity, it is the mechanism by which it operates. The city has a unique franchise. Businesses that operate within the square mile are entitled to vote in city elections through a system of corporate votes that was formalized in the City of London Ward Elections Act of 2002. This means that the electorate of the city is dominated not by residents, of whom there are fewer than 10,000, but by the businesses that operate within its boundaries, businesses that include the global headquarters of banks, insurance companies, law firms, and financial services firms. The city is, in essence, a jurisdiction governed by capital rather than by people, and this governance structure is not hidden. It is public, it is legal, it is documented in statutes and constitutional instruments, and yet it is, for the overwhelming majority of British citizens, completely invisible, because the compression algorithm files the City of London under financial district, the same category as Wall Street or La Défense or Frankfurt's Bank and Viertel, and the categorical tag terminates the investigation before the extraordinary constitutional architecture can be perceived. And within this constitutionally liminal jurisdiction, operating through its own distinct set of institutional liminalities, sits Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's is not an insurance company. This is the first and most important decompression that must occur. When the compression algorithm fires insurance company at Lloyd's, it imports a prototype that is catastrophically inaccurate. A corporation with a headquarters, a CEO, a balance sheet, policies it issues, premiums it collects, and claims it pays. Lloyd's is none of these things. Lloyd's is a market. It is a physical and institutional space in which independent syndicates, each backed by its own capital, each managed by its own underwriters, each operating as a distinct business entity, come together to write insurance risk. The syndicates are supported by names, individuals who pledge their personal wealth to back the underwriting activities of the syndicates, and by corporate capital vehicles that have increasingly replaced individual names since the near-catastrophic losses of the early 1990s. Lloyd's itself provides the physical market space, the regulatory framework, the shared infrastructure for claims, processing, and policy administration, and the brand, the collective reputation that allows Lloyd's syndicates to access risks that no individual syndicate could access on its own. This structure is, in every meaningful sense, liminal. Lloyd's is between an insurance company and a stock exchange. It is between a mutual and a marketplace. It is between a regulator and a participant. It is between a medieval guild and a modern financial institution. And it has been operating in this liminality for more than 330 years, since its origins in Edward Lloyd's coffee house in the 1680s, where ship owners, merchants, and wealthy individuals would gather to negotiate the sharing of maritime risk. The coffee house was itself a liminal space, a commercial establishment that functioned as an informal exchange, a social club that functioned as a financial market, a place of gossip and conversation that functioned as the most sophisticated risk assessment mechanism in the world. And the institutional descendant of that coffee house has preserved, through centuries of evolution, the essential liminality of its origins. Now, connect this institutional liminality to the broader architecture of British power. Lloyd's does not merely write insurance. Lloyd's writes insurance for risks that no conventional insurance market can or will underwrite. It writes marine insurance, the insurance that covers ships, cargoes, and the liabilities arising from global maritime trade. It writes aviation insurance, covering the global airline fleet. It writes political risk insurance, covering investments in unstable jurisdictions. It writes satellite insurance, covering the launch and operation of commercial satellites. It writes kidnap and ransom insurance. It writes cyber risk insurance. It writes terrorism insurance. It writes, in short, the insurance that covers the operational infrastructure of global power, the ships, the planes, the satellites, the investments, the personnel that constitute the physical and financial architecture through which international trade, geopolitical influence, and military power projection operate. And the underwriting decisions made at Lloyd's are not merely financial transactions, they are governance decisions. When Lloyd's syndicates decide which maritime routes are insurable and at what cost, they are effectively determining which trade routes are economically viable. When they set the war risk premium for vessels transiting a particular strait, they are effectively taxing international trade through that passage. When they determine the political risk premium for investments in a particular country, they are effectively rating the sovereign creditworthiness of that country through a mechanism that is more granular, more responsive, and in many cases more consequential than the sovereign credit ratings issued by agencies like Standard & Poor's or Moody's. These are governance decisions that affect the global economy, that shape trade flows, that influence geopolitical strategy, and that operate entirely outside the framework of democratic accountability because they are categorized as insurance. And insurance is categorized as a boring private sector activity that has nothing to do with governance. This categorical camouflage is not incidental. It is the mechanism by which Lloyd's and the broader City of London financial ecosystem exercises power. The power is exercised through liminality, through the exploitation of the categorical gap between private sector and governance, between financial services and sovereign decision-making, between market and state. And the gap is maintained by the compression algorithm of public perception, which files Lloyd's under insurance company, files the City of London under financial district, and terminates the investigation before the actual power structure can be perceived. But the liminality goes deeper still, because the regulatory architecture within which Lloyd's operates is itself liminal in ways that are structurally significant. Insurance regulation in the UK operates through a dual system. The Prudential Regulation Authority, a subsidiary of the Bank of England, handles the financial soundness of insurance entities, while the Financial Conduct Authority handles market conduct and consumer protection. But Lloyd's, because of its sui generis structure, is regulated through a framework that is distinct from the framework that applies to conventional insurance companies. The Lloyd's Act of 1871, updated by the Lloyd's Act of 1982, provides the statutory foundation for Lloyd's governance, and the Council of Lloyd's, which includes both market practitioners and independent members, operates as a self-regulatory body with powers that, in any other industry, would be exercised by an external government regulator. This is regulatory liminality. Lloyd's is between self-regulation and external regulation, between market participant and market regulator, between a privately governed institution and a publicly accountable one. And this liminality, like every liminality we have examined, generates power. It generates the power of the uncontained, the power of the entity that the categorical system of governance cannot fully process, cannot fully supervise, and cannot fully control, because it exists in the dimensional space between the categories that the governance system uses to locate and regulate its subjects. And now, here is the connection that makes the entire framework cohere. The same structural liminality that generates power at Lloyd's, the liminality between market and regulator, between private and public, between medieval guild and modern financial institution, is the same structural liminality that generates power in the UK cultural ecosystem. The Brit School, the tuition-free performing arts institution that produces liminal artists, is itself a liminal institution within the British educational system, occupying a space between state school and conservatory that the categorical system of education cannot fully process. The West End theater ecosystem, the most concentrated performing arts market outside Broadway, operates in a liminality between commercial entertainment and subsidized art, between mass culture and elite culture, between the entertainment industry and the educational system that feeds it. The London music scene operates in a liminality between global commercial markets and the local cultural production, between the major label system and the independent ecosystem, between the digital distribution platforms that have globalized music consumption and the physical venues and scenes that remain stubbornly local. These are not separate liminalities. They are manifestations of a single structural condition. London is a city that is constitutionally, financially, culturally, and institutionally organized around the exploitation of liminality. The City of London's constitutional anomaly is not an accident of history. It is the prototype, the original instance of a structural principle that pervades the entire British power architecture. The principle that power accrues to entities that exist between categories, that the space between categories is the space where governance cannot reach, where containment cannot operate, where the compression algorithm fails, and the full resolution complexity of the system generates effects that are invisible, uncontainable, and therefore unopposable. This is why London, a city in a post-imperial nation with a GDP smaller than that of California, continues to exercise a disproportionate influence on global finance, global culture, and global governance. It is not because London is the largest, or the wealthiest, or the most technologically advanced city in the world. It is because London is the most liminal. It is the city that has most effectively institutionalized the exploitation of the space between categories, the space where the compression algorithm fails, the space where the dimension lacuna is thinnest, the space where the invisible systems that actually govern the world operate without scrutiny, without containment, and without the consent of the governed, because the governed cannot perceive what they have not been given the categories to see. The marine insurance underwriter at Lloyd's and the musical theater student at the Brit School are not in the same industry. They are not in the same social class. They are not in the same cultural world, but they are in the same structural position. They are both operating in the space between categories. They are both generating power from liminality, and they are both products of a system, a London system, that has been perfecting the exploitation of liminality for centuries. The system does not have a name. It does not have a headquarters. It does not have a manifesto. It has never been formally described, because describing it would require a cognitive framework that spans the categorical boundaries between finance, culture, education, constitutional law, urban geography, insurance, theater, music, and class politics. And no such framework exists within the existing academic, journalistic, or political institutions, because those institutions are themselves organized along the categorical boundaries that the system exploits. Until now, because what we have been building, section by section, decompression by decompression, is precisely that framework. And with it, we can now see the system, we can see the invisible architecture, we can see the liminality engine, and we can see why J.K. Rowling, when she sat down to write a fantasy novel about a world of magic hidden within the ordinary world, a world accessible only through a platform that is between platforms, a world governed by institutions that are between institutions, a world in which power is generated by those who can move between the magical and the mundane, produced something that was not entirely fiction. She produced, without perhaps fully knowing what she was doing, a description of the actual system, a system that has been operating in London, in the space between the categories, for hundreds of years, a system that is invisible to the muggles. J.K. Rowling was broke. This is the compression that the media narrative provides, and like all compressions, it captures a surface fact while annihilating the structural context that gives the fact its meaning. She was a single mother living on benefits in Edinburgh, writing in cafes because her flat was cold, producing a manuscript about a boy wizard that had been rejected by 12 publishers before Bloomsbury, a small London publishing house, took a chance on it. This is the story. This is the myth. And like all myths, it functions as a compression algorithm, reducing an event of extraordinary structural complexity to a narrative that the existing categorical system can process. Underdog succeeds, talent prevails, the system works. But the system that Rowling described in her novels, whether she knew it or not, is not the system that the myth celebrates. It is its inverse. It is a system in which the most powerful forces in the world operate invisibly, concealed within the ordinary, accessible only to those who possess the specific perceptual framework necessary to see them, and categorically invisible to everyone else. Rowling called the invisible system the wizarding world. She called the uninitiated muggles, and she placed the entry point to the invisible system in a London train station at a platform that exists between platforms, a platform numbered 9 3/4, a platform that is, in the precise language of our framework, liminal. This is not a literary analysis. This is a structural correspondence. And the correspondences are so numerous, so precise, and so deeply layered that they cannot be dismissed as coincidence. They are the product of a writer who was immersed, whether consciously or not, in the same institutional and cultural ecosystem that we have been decompressing throughout this document, and who translated the structural logic of that ecosystem into narrative form with a fidelity that makes the Harry Potter series, when read through the decompressive framework, less a work of fantasy and more a coded ethnography of British power. Consider the structure of Hogwarts itself. Hogwarts is a school, But it is not a school in the way that the compression algorithm defines schools. It is not a place where standardized curricula are delivered to students who will be sorted into standardized professional categories upon graduation. Hogwarts is a school where students are sorted into houses that correspond not to academic disciplines, but to temperamental dispositions, courage, ambition, intellect, loyalty. The sorting is performed by an artifact, the sorting hat, that reads the student's character and assigns them to a house that will shape their social identity, their peer group, their self-conception, and their trajectory through the institution for the duration of their enrollment. This is not a fantastical invention. This is a recognizable description of the British school system, specifically the public school system, the elite boarding schools, Eton, Harrow, Winchester, Rugby, Westminster, that have, for centuries, functioned as sorting mechanisms that assign students not merely to educational tracks, but to social identities, institutional loyalties, and networks of mutual obligation that persist or for life. The old school tie is not a metaphor. It is a technology of social categorization and institutional belonging that operates in British society with a pervasiveness and a durability that Americans, operating within a different categorical system, find difficult to comprehend. And the subjects taught at Hogwarts are not academic disciplines. They are, when you decompress them from the fantastical terminology, the actual operative skills of the British power system. Potions is chemistry, but not the standardized chemistry of the state school curriculum. It is the artisanal, craft-based, tacit knowledge-intensive chemistry of a system in which knowledge is transmitted not through textbooks, but through apprenticeship, through direct relationship with a master who possesses skills that cannot be fully codified. Defense against the dark arts is political and strategic education, the training in how to identify, confront, and counter threats to the system, training that is itself liminal, existing between the military and the civilian, between the institutional and the personal, between the codified and the improvisational. Transfiguration is the art of categorical transformation, the ability to change the category that an entity occupies, to make one thing become another thing, which is, when you decompress it from the fantastical, a precise description of the core skill of the London power system, the ability to move between categories, to transform the categorical identity of an entity, to exploit the liminality between what something is and what it appears to be. Consider the Ministry of Magic. It is a government, but it is not a government that is visible to the ordinary public. It operates within the same physical space as the mundane government, the government of Muggles, but it is architecturally concealed. Its entrance is through a telephone box, through a visitor's entrance that is deliberately mundane, deliberately unremarkable, deliberately camouflaged within the ordinary infrastructure of London. And within the ministry, there are departments that correspond, with striking precision, to the actual departments of British governance that operate in the liminality we have been describing. The Department of International Magical Cooperation corresponds to the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office, but the magical version foregrounds what the mundane version conceals, that international diplomacy is not merely the management of state-to-state relationships, but the management of power relationships that operate through systems that are invisible to ordinary citizens. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures corresponds to the regulatory apparatus that manages entities that exist between categories, entities that the categorical system of governance cannot fully classify and therefore cannot fully regulate, entities that in the real world include the Lloyd's Market, the City of London Corporation, and the entire ecosystem of financial and cultural institutions that generate power from their uncategorizability. And then there is Diagon Alley, the commercial district of the wizarding world, a marketplace that is hidden within London, accessible only through a specific entrance in a specific pub, a pub that is invisible to Muggles because they lack the perceptual framework to see it. Diagon Alley is a market in which specialized goods are traded, goods that have no equivalent in the mundane world, goods whose value is determined not by supply and demand in the ordinary sense, but by their utility within a system of power that the ordinary world cannot perceive. And at the center of Diagon Alley sits Gringotts, the bank. Gringotts is run by goblins, beings who are categorically distinct from both wizards and muggles, beings who exist in their own form of liminality, and who have, through their mastery of a specific domain, financial management and precious metals, accumulated a form of power that even the wizarding establishment cannot fully contain. Gringotts is the Bank of England. Gringotts is Lloyd's. Gringotts is the City of London Corporation. Gringotts is the institutional expression of the principle that financial power accrues to entities that exist in categorical liminality, entities that are part of the system but not fully within the system, entities that the system depends on but cannot fully govern, entities that exploit the gap between categories to accumulate a form of power that is invisible to those who lack the perceptual framework to see it. The structural correspondences continue. The wizarding world has its own legal system, its own courts, its own prisons, all operating invisibly within the same geographic space as the mundane world. The wizarding world has its own media, the Daily Prophet, which functions as a propaganda apparatus that shapes public perception within the invisible system. The wizarding world has its own class system, with pure-blood families occupying the highest social positions, half-bloods occupying an intermediate position, and muggleborns occupying the lowest, a class system that maps onto the actual British class system with an uncomfortable precision that Rowling may or may not have intended. And the central conflict of the entire series, the war between Voldemort's faction and the Order of the Phoenix, is a conflict over the question of whether the invisible system should be open or closed, whether the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds should be porous or impermeable, whether liminality should be embraced or eliminated. This is not allegory in the conventional literary sense. Allegory is a conscious, deliberate mapping of one set of meanings onto another. What Rowling produced is something more powerful and more revealing than allegory. She produced a structural homology, a narrative that replicates the structural logic of a real system with such fidelity that the narrative can be used as a map of the real system, a map that reveals features that are invisible when you look at the real system directly, because the real system's invisibility is its defining feature. You cannot see the real system by looking at it, because looking at it means looking through the compression algorithm that renders it invisible. But you can see the real system by looking at its fictional reflection, because the fictional reflection, freed from the constraint of operating within the actual categorical system, can show the structure without the camouflage. This is what Hogwarts was. Not a fantasy, a documentary. A documentary of a system that exists in London, that has existed for centuries, that generates power from liminality, that operates in the space between categories, that is invisible to those who lack the perceptual framework to see it, and that shapes the lives of everyone within its reach, whether they perceive it or not. The train to Hogwarts departs from King's Cross Station, one of the major railway terminals in London. The platform is between platforms 9 and 10, a space that is physically present but perceptually invisible. You access it by walking directly at a solid wall, an act that requires either knowledge that the wall is not solid or faith that the system beyond the wall is real. And when you pass through the wall, you enter a world that was there all along, operating all along, governing all along, invisible all along, hidden not by concealment but by compression, by the categorical infrastructure that made the wall look solid, that made the platform look like it did not exist, that made the system look like it was not there. We have, in this document, been walking at the wall. We started with the compression algorithm, the cognitive architecture that reduces reality to survival-grade resolution. We decompressed a gas station and found a retail operation whose scale was invisible because of a categorical tag. We decompressed a Target and found a secular cathedral where middle-class American identity is performed as a ritual. We examined the dimension lacuna and established that invisible systems operate within it at all times. We decompressed the underwriting dimension and found an invisible government that determines life outcomes through actuarial architecture. We examined Shor's algorithm and found that the space between academic categories is where dimensional breaches occur. We examined Michel Lamy and found that liminality, when practiced as a way of being, generates a form of power that the categorical system experiences as magic. We examined Raye, Olivia Dean, and FKA Twigs, and found that London produces liminal cultural figures through a system of intersecting institutional, demographic, and economic conditions. We examined Lloyd's, the City of London, and the regulatory architecture of British finance, and found that institutional liminality has been exploited as a mechanism of power for centuries. And now, having assembled all of these decompressions into a single framework, we can see what Rowling saw, or at least what she translated into narrative form, that London contains within it, operating between its visible categories, a system of interconnected institutions, cultural pipelines, financial architectures, and regulatory anomalies that constitutes an invisible world, a world that generates power from its invisibility, a world that is accessible only to those who possess the framework to perceive it, a world that has been operating for centuries, shaping the visible world from within the dimension lacuna, hidden not by walls or secrets or conspiracies, but by the most effective concealment mechanism ever devised, the categorical infrastructure of ordinary human perception. The compression gave you London. It gave you a city of stores, banks, theaters, schools, pubs, and financial offices. It gave you a navigable, survivable, comprehensible London. But it took from you the actual London, the London where the British School and Lloyd's are manifestations of the same structural principle, the London where a musical theater student and a marine insurance underwriter are operating in the same dimensional space, the London where the City of London Corporation and the West End theater ecosystem are connected not by personnel or policy, but by structural homology, by the shared exploitation of the power that accrues to entities that exist between categories, the London where the gap between Platform 9 and Platform 10 contains, if you have the framework to see it, an entire world. That world is real. It has always been real. And the only thing that ever made it invisible was the compression algorithm that told you it was a wall. It was never a wall. It was a dimension. And you have, over the course of this document, been given the framework to walk through it. What you do with what you see on the other side is up to you.